In the blood-soaked annals of the 41st millennium, where 10,000 years of endless war have carved scars across the galaxy itself, no conflict burns brighter in infamy than the war that set brother against brother, Space Marine against Space Marine, in a conflagration that would forever change the very meaning of loyalty to the Emperor. The Badab War stands as the greatest shame in the history of the Adeptus Astartes. A civil war so devastating that its echoes still reverberate through every chapter's sacred halls. A reminder that even the Emperor's finest angels of death can fall to corruption and hubris. When the 41st millennium was still young, and the Imperium's borders expanded with each passing decade, long before the current age of shrinking light and eternal siege, the Badab sector emerged from the cosmic darkness as a crown jewel of human achievement. Here, in 18 star systems rich beyond measure, Space Marines ruled not as mere guardians, but as absolute sovereigns over worlds that willingly bowed before their might. The sector's origins remain shrouded in mystery even to the most learned chapter masters of today, buried beneath layers of propaganda and purged records. But what fragments of ancient knowledge survive paint a terrifying picture of warriors who achieved mastery over entire stellar regions, when loyalty was still considered absolute and unquestionable. Archaeological evidence recovered from the shattered remains of the Palace of Thorns suggests that the Astral Claws chapter established their dominion over Badab Primaris sometime during the 38th millennium, transforming what had been a collection of struggling frontier worlds into a military powerhouse that could field fleets rivaling entire Imperial battle groups. Fragmentary records speak of a chapter that grew beyond all recognition, swelling their ranks far past the sacred 1,000 mandated by the Codex Astartes, recruiting from populations that worshipped them not just as protectors but as living gods walking among mortals. The Badab sector occupied a position of critical strategic importance in the galactic southeast, serving as humanity's primary bulwark against the chaotic energies emanating from the Maelstrom, that vast warp storm whose tendrils of madness constantly threaten to engulf entire systems in unreality. Compared to the current state of the galaxy, where every world stands perpetually under siege, and every victory is paid for in oceans of blood, the Badab sector during its golden age contained perhaps 10 times more stable warp routes, 100 times more productive mining operations, and 1,000 times more hope for humanity's future than exists in any equivalent region today. The man who would become known throughout the galaxy as the Tyrant of Badab began his career as Lufgt Huron, a space marine of such exceptional capability that his very name inspired confidence in Imperial commanders across a dozen sectors. Chapter records describe a warrior who epitomized everything the Adeptus Astartes represented: tactical brilliance matched by unwavering loyalty, strategic vision tempered by absolute devotion to the Emperor's will, and a charisma that could inspire ordinary mortals to acts of extraordinary heroism. In those early years, before corruption took root in his enhanced heart, Huron led the Astral Claws to victory after victory against Orc incursions, Eldar raiders, and the ever-present threat of chaos cultists seeking to exploit the Maelstrom's influence. But even in those days of triumph and glory, astute observers noted disturbing signs that something fundamental was shifting in the Badab sector. The Astral Claws began to view themselves not as servants of the distant Emperor on Terra, but as the rightful rulers of their domain, protectors who deserved absolute authority over those they defended. Imperial tithes, once paid without question, began arriving late or short of the demanded amounts. Requests for reinforcement from other chapters went unheeded as the Astral Claws claimed their forces were needed for local threats that seemed to grow more numerous and dangerous with each passing year. What truly happened in those crucial early years remains one of the great mysteries of Imperial history, deliberately obscured by those who survived the coming catastrophe. However, recently discovered astropathic communications suggest that by the dawn of the 41st millennium, the Badab sector had effectively seceded from Imperial authority in all but name. The Astral Claws had grown to nearly twice their authorized strength, recruited not from distant worlds as tradition demanded, but from the very populations they protected, creating bonds of loyalty that ran deeper than mere duty to a far-off emperor. Yet beneath this surface of military efficiency and regional prosperity, something far more sinister was taking root. The Palace of Thorns, that magnificent fortress monastery carved from the living rock of Badab Primaris, began experiencing what official reports term technical difficulties, but which survivor accounts describe as manifestations of otherworldly power. Strange lights were seen in chambers that should have remained dark, and the very architecture seemed to shift when observed from the corner of one's eye. Most disturbing of all, the Astral Claws themselves began to change, not just in attitude and doctrine, but in ways that would only become apparent when the final reckoning arrived. The scale of what was unfolding in the Badab sector defied all previous understanding of Space Marine rebellion. This was not a simple case of a chapter master overstepping his authority, or a dispute over strategic priorities that could be resolved through negotiation and compromise. Archaeological evidence now suggests that the Astral Claws controlled a military force equivalent to an entire Space Marine legion, complete with their own forge worlds, training facilities, and recruitment infrastructure. They commanded void fleets that could challenge Imperial Navy battle groups, planetary defense forces that outnumbered entire Imperial Guard regiments, and most terrifyingly of all, the absolute loyalty of populations numbering in the billions. When the first reports of open defiance reached Terra, the initial response was disbelief. Space Marines simply did not rebel against the Emperor. The very concept violated everything the Adeptus Astartes represented, everything they had been created to embody. Yet as evidence mounted of a chapter that had not merely overstepped its bounds, but had actively rejected Imperial authority, the magnitude of the crisis became undeniable. This was not a problem that could be solved through political maneuvering or diplomatic pressure. This was a threat that struck at the very foundation of what it meant to be a Space Marine. The implications extended far beyond a single rogue chapter in a remote sector. If the Emperor's finest warriors could turn against their oaths, if chapters could simply decide to carve out their own kingdoms and rule as they saw fit, then what prevented every Space Marine force in the galaxy from making the same choice? The precedent was unthinkable, the potential consequences catastrophic beyond measure. To understand the magnitude of what was lost when the Badab War finally erupted across 18 star systems, one must first comprehend the extraordinary civilization that the Astral Claws had built in the far reaches of the Ultima Segmentum. The Badab sector during its golden age represented perhaps the most successful example of Space Marine governance in Imperial history, a collection of worlds that had transformed from struggling frontier colonies into a military and economic powerhouse that rivaled entire subsectors in its productive capacity and defensive strength. The Badab sector occupied a position of critical strategic importance, approximately 3,000 light-years rimward of Ultramar, serving as humanity's primary buffer zone against the chaotic energies of the Maelstrom. This vast warp storm, one of the largest permanent disturbances in real space outside the Eye of Terror itself, generated constant threats that required equally constant vigilance. Daemon incursions, chaos pirate raids, and reality storms capable of transforming entire worlds into nightmarish parodies of their former selves emerged from the Maelstrom's roiling depths with terrifying regularity, making the sector's strategic value to the broader Imperium impossible to overstate. The 18 inhabited systems under Astral Claws protection included some of the richest mineral deposits in the known galaxy. Bad Primaris itself sat atop veins of rare earth elements essential to advanced technology production, while the mining worlds of Sagan and Bellerophon's Fall contained adamantium deposits so pure that a single shipment could supply an entire forge world's requirements for years. Archaeological surveys conducted in the war's aftermath revealed mining operations of staggering scope, with deep core extraction facilities that penetrated dozens of kilometers into planetary mantles, supported by populations of specialized tech adepts and servitor workers, numbering in the hundreds of millions. The wealth generated by these mining operations funded military expansion on an unprecedented scale. By the dawn of the 41st millennium, the Astral Claws maintained not merely a chapter fleet, but a naval force equivalent to an entire Imperial battle fleet, complete with multiple battle barges, dozens of strike cruisers, and hundreds of escort vessels. Their forge facilities on Badab Secundus produced weapons and equipment of such exceptional quality that other chapters actively sought trading agreements to acquire Astral Claws manufactured gear. Most remarkably of all, they had developed independent recruitment and training capabilities that could theoretically sustain multiple chapters simultaneously. Chapter Master Lufgt Huron's early career provided ample evidence of the extraordinary leadership that would eventually transform the Astral Claws from a standard codex-compliant chapter into something far more ambitious and dangerous. Imperial records from the late 39th millennium describe a warrior of exceptional tactical brilliance, capable of coordinating complex multi-system operations with a skill that impressed even veteran Space Marine commanders. His victories against the Orkwas of Scarjaw the Red-Tusked became legendary throughout the Ultima Segmentum, while his successful defense of the Loyalty's reward system against a massive chaos incursion earned him personal commendation from the High Lords of Terra themselves. Under Huron's guidance, the Astral Claws developed military doctrines that emphasized rapid deployment, overwhelming force application, and seamless integration between Space Marine forces and local planetary defense units. Their recruitment practices expanded beyond traditional parameters, drawing candidates not just from death worlds and hive gangs, but from the educated populations of their protectorates, creating Space Marines with technical expertise and local knowledge that proved invaluable in both combat operations and administrative functions. By the time the 41st millennium dawned, the Astral Claws had effectively become the de facto rulers of their sector, with chapter serfs and support staff managing everything from interplanetary trade to judicial proceedings. The relationship between the Astral Claws and their subject populations evolved along lines that would have seemed impossible in more orthodox regions of Imperial space. Rather than the distant reverence typically shown to Space Marines, the populations of the Badab sector developed a personal loyalty to their protectors that bordered on worship. Astral Claws' battle brothers were not merely seen as enhanced warriors serving a distant emperor, but as local heroes who shared the dangers and triumphs of daily life in the sector. Children grew up dreaming not of joining the Imperial Guard or serving in the Administratum, but of earning selection for the Astral Claws recruitment trials. This unprecedented integration between Space Marines and civilian populations created a military-industrial complex of extraordinary efficiency and loyalty. When the Astral Claws called for volunteers to crew their expanding fleet, entire families competed for the honor of serving. When new fortifications were required, planetary governments mobilized resources on a scale normally reserved for responding to invasion threats. Most significantly, when the chapter began recruiting beyond their traditional 1,000 Marine limit, local populations celebrated each new battle brother as a personal victory for their world's contribution to the sector's defense. The growing autonomy that would eventually lead to outright rebellion manifested itself gradually through a series of seemingly minor policy changes that cumulatively represented a fundamental shift in the relationship between the Badab sector and Imperial authority. Imperial tithes, which had once been paid promptly and in full, began arriving with increasing delays and shortfalls. Official justifications cited the need to maintain larger defensive forces due to increased chaos threats, but careful analysis of the numbers revealed systematic reduction in tribute payments that suggested deliberate policy rather than emergency necessity. More concerning to Imperial observers were the changes in Astral Claws' patrol patterns and operational priorities. Where once the chapter had responded promptly to requests for assistance from neighboring sectors, they increasingly claimed that local threats required their full attention and resources. Their patrol routes, which had traditionally extended well beyond the Badab sector's boundaries, contracted to focus primarily on their immediate area of control. Most troubling of all, they began establishing permanent outposts and supply depots in systems that technically fell outside their assigned protection zone, effectively expanding their territory without official authorization. The Palace of Thorns, that magnificent fortress monastery, that served as both the Astral Claws' headquarters and the symbolic center of their growing power, underwent massive expansion during this period. What had begun as a formidable but conventional chapter monastery grew into a complex that rivaled the greatest Imperial installations, with defensive capabilities that could withstand siege by multiple Space Marine chapters simultaneously. Deep beneath the palace's foundations, construction crews carved out vast chambers whose purpose remained unknown, even to most Astral Claws themselves, spaces that would only reveal their true significance when the final confrontation arrived. The statistical evidence of the Badab sector's growing independence becomes clear when examining the data that Imperial bureaucrats meticulously recorded, despite their growing inability to enforce compliance. Imperial tithes dropped from 100% compliance to 90% over the course of a decade, then to 80%, then to levels so low that administrative officials began classifying the shortfalls as acts of rebellion rather than administrative difficulties. Chapter strength, which should have remained stable at approximately 1,000 battle brothers, grew to 1,200 confirmed Marines, with unofficial estimates suggesting numbers as high as 1,500 or more. The sector's defense fleets, which Imperial doctrine suggested should consist of a handful of patrol vessels and system monitors, expanded to include capital ships that could challenge Imperial Navy cruisers in single combat. Local planetary defense forces, rather than maintaining the minimal strength required for basic security, were equipped and trained to standards that rivaled elite Imperial Guard regiments. Most significantly, the integration between these various military forces reached levels of coordination that suggested unified command structure, extending far beyond anything authorized by Imperial regulations. Yet for all the warning signs visible to careful analysis, the Badab sector during its golden age represented an extraordinary achievement in human governance and military organization. Crime rates fell to nearly zero across all 18 systems. Economic productivity reached levels that made other sectors envious. Scientific and technological advancement proceeded at rates that attracted attention from forge worlds and research institutions throughout the galaxy. The populations under Astral Claws protection enjoyed standards of living and personal security that most Imperial citizens could barely imagine, creating a loyalty that would prove both a blessing and a curse when the final reckoning arrived. The early signs of change that would eventually lead to civil war were subtle enough that even experienced Imperial observers initially dismissed them as natural variations in chapter behavior, rather than evidence of systematic rebellion. Patrol reports mentioned slight increases in aggressive responses to Imperial inspection teams. Administrative delays in responding to official communications grew longer and more frequent. Most tellingly, the Astral Claws began restricting access to certain areas of their territory, claiming security concerns that seemed disproportionate to the threats they described. As the conditions that would eventually spark the Badab War continued to develop throughout the closing years of the 40th millennium, connections were forming between the Astral Claws and other elements that the distant authorities on Terra could not yet comprehend. Secret negotiations with neighboring Space Marine chapters, clandestine meetings with representatives of other sectors showing signs of independence movements, and most ominously, exploratory contacts with forces whose loyalty to the Emperor was questionable at best. The stage was being set for a conflict that would test the very foundations of Imperial unity and reveal truths about Space Marine nature that many would prefer had remained hidden forever. The transformation of Lufgt Huron from loyal chapter master into the figure history would remember as the Tyrant of Badab did not happen overnight. Like the corruption that would eventually consume his soul, this metamorphosis unfolded gradually, each seemingly justified decision building upon the last until the accumulated weight of choices led him far from the path of righteousness. What began as practical governance solutions for a frontier sector evolved into something far more dangerous, a fundamental challenge to the very structure of Imperial authority that would ultimately require the combined might of multiple Space Marine chapters to contain. The creation of what Huron initially termed the Badab War Council in 901.mem41 represented perhaps the single most significant political innovation in Space Marine history since the formation of the Adeptus Astartes itself. Unlike the traditional model where Space Marines served as protectors while leaving actual governance to Imperial administrators, Huron's council integrated military and civilian authority under direct chapter control. Representatives from each of the 18 systems met regularly on Badab Primaris to coordinate everything from resource allocation to interplanetary trade policy, creating an unprecedented level of cooperation and efficiency that quickly became the envy of neighboring sectors. The genius of Huron's approach lay in his understanding that effective protection required more than simply responding to threats after they materialized. By taking direct control over economic planning, population distribution, and infrastructure development, the Astral Claws could anticipate problems before they became crises and mobilize resources with a speed and precision that traditional Imperial bureaucracy simply could not match. When Orc raiders threatened the mining operations on Sagan, the War Council had already positioned defensive assets and evacuation protocols that minimized both casualties and production losses. When Chaos cultists attempted to infiltrate the industrial centers of Bellerophon's fall, integrated intelligence networks detected and eliminated the threat before it could take root. The formal establishment of what Huron boldly declared the Autonomous Protectorate of Badab marked the point where practical governance crossed the line into open defiance of Imperial authority. The term itself was carefully chosen to suggest temporary emergency measures rather than permanent rebellion, but the implications were unmistakable. For the first time in Imperial history, a Space Marine chapter was claiming not just military authority over their assigned sector, but complete political and economic sovereignty as well. The precedent was staggering in its audacity and terrifying in its potential consequences. Huron's personal evolution during this period reflected the broader changes occurring throughout the Astral Claws chapter. Those who knew him in his early years as chapter master described a warrior who embodied the finest traditions of the Adeptus Astartes, a leader who sought counsel from his battle brothers and maintained regular communication with Imperial authorities. The Huron who emerged as architect of the Badab Protectorate was a fundamentally different figure, one who spoke less of duty to the Emperor and more of responsibility to the populations under his protection. His rhetoric increasingly emphasized the failures of distant Terra to understand or support the challenges facing frontier regions, painting the Astral Claws not as rebels, but as the only force capable of providing effective governance in a galaxy where the Imperial bureaucracy had grown too corrupt and inefficient to function. The recruitment practices that allowed the Astral Claws to grow far beyond their authorized strength represented another crucial element in Huron's transformation of the sector. Traditional Space Marine recruitment drew candidates from across the galaxy, ensuring that no chapter developed excessive loyalty to any single world or population. Huron reversed this practice entirely, restricting recruitment to the Badab sector itself and encouraging the development of personal bonds between Marines and the civilians they protected. The result was a chapter whose loyalty ran first to their immediate communities and only secondarily to the distant figure of the Emperor on Terra. This localized recruitment created feedback loops that accelerated the sector's separation from Imperial norms. Young men selected for Space Marine enhancement came from families who had prospered under Astral Claws protection, who viewed the chapter not as representatives of Imperial authority, but as heroes of their own communities. When these recruits completed their transformation and returned to serve as full battle brothers, they brought with them personal connections and local knowledge that made them even more effective protectors of their birth worlds. The psychological impact was profound, creating a chapter that saw itself as belonging to the Badab sector rather than serving it on behalf of a distant emperor. The first formal refusal of Imperial tithe collection ships in late 901.M41 sent shockwaves through the administratum that reverberated all the way to the highest levels of the Imperial government on Terra. The economic implications alone were staggering, as the Badab sector contributed resources equivalent to the output of dozens of less productive regions. More disturbing than the financial loss, however, was the precedent being set. If Space Marine chapters could simply decide to cease supporting the broader Imperial war effort, the entire economic foundation of humanity's galactic empire would collapse within generations. Huron's justification for the tithe refusal demonstrated his evolving mastery of political rhetoric and his growing confidence in his ability to challenge Imperial authority directly. Rather than simply declaring independence, he framed the decision as a temporary measure necessitated by increased threat levels that required all available resources for local defense. He provided detailed reports documenting increased chaos incursions from the Maelstrom, expanded Orc activity in neighboring systems, and evidence of Eldar raiders probing sector defenses. While these threats were real, Imperial intelligence analysis quickly revealed that they were not significantly greater than historical norms, suggesting that the tithe refusal was motivated by political rather than military necessity. The secret negotiations that began during this period represented perhaps the most dangerous aspect of Huron's emerging rebellion. Rather than acting as an isolated rogue chapter, the Astral Claws began reaching out to other Space Marine forces whose loyalty to Imperial authority showed signs of strain. The Mantis Warriors chapter, struggling with their own conflicts with Imperial bureaucracy over recruitment and operational priorities, proved receptive to discussions about greater Space Marine autonomy. The Executioners chapter, frustrated by what they perceived as wasteful deployment of their forces in meaningless conflicts, began exploring alternatives to traditional Imperial command structures. Most significantly, Huron initiated contact with the Lamenters chapter, whose tragic history of persecution and misfortune had left them bitter toward the Imperial authorities, who seemed determined to assign them the most dangerous and thankless missions. The Lamenters' reputation for self-sacrifice and nobility made them valuable allies, as their participation in any rebellion would lend credibility to claims that the movement represented principled resistance to Imperial corruption rather than simple ambition or greed. The gradual expansion of what would become known as the Secessionist alliance demonstrated Huron's sophisticated understanding of both military strategy and political psychology. Rather than attempting to recruit allies through grand proclamations or ideological appeals, he focused on practical cooperation and mutual benefit. Joint training exercises between Astral Claws and allied forces improved combat effectiveness for all participants. Shared intelligence networks enhanced threat detection and response capabilities across multiple sectors. Most importantly, coordinated resource sharing allowed participating chapters to reduce their dependence on Imperial supply lines while improving their operational readiness. The psychological transformation that accompanied these political and military developments extended throughout the Astral Claws chapter, affecting not just the leadership but ordinary battle brothers as well. Marines who had once spoken proudly of serving the Emperor of Mankind began to focus their loyalty on more immediate and tangible figures. Chapter serfs and support personnel, drawn increasingly from local populations, developed personal relationships with the warriors they served that created bonds of loyalty independent of any abstract devotion to Imperial ideology. The result was a chapter whose members fought not for distant Terra, but for the worlds and people they could see and touch and protect directly. The expansion of the Palace of Thorns during this period reflected both the growing ambitions of the Astral Claws and the resources available to fulfill those ambitions. What had once been an impressive but conventional fortress monastery grew into a complex that rivaled the greatest Imperial installations, with defensive capabilities designed to withstand siege by multiple enemy forces simultaneously. Deep beneath the palace foundations, construction crews carved out vast chambers whose purpose remained mysterious even to most chapter members, spaces that would only reveal their true significance when the final confrontation arrived. The integration of military and civilian authority that characterized Huron's governance model created efficiencies that even hostile Imperial observers were forced to acknowledge. Crime rates across the Badab sector fell to levels not seen since the Great Crusade era. Economic productivity reached heights that made neighboring regions openly envious. Most importantly, from a military perspective, the seamless coordination between Space Marine forces and local defense assets created a defensive capability that far exceeded what either could achieve independently. Yet beneath these surface successes, more troubling developments were taking root. Astral Claws battle brothers began displaying personality changes that went beyond simple political evolution. Veterans who had once counseled moderation and restraint found themselves swept up in the enthusiasm for greater independence and autonomy. The chapter's chaplains, traditionally the guardians of spiritual purity and loyalty to the Emperor, began incorporating local customs and beliefs into their sermons and ceremonies. Most ominously, reports began circulating of strange incidents during recruitment trials, cases where candidates seemed to undergo transformations that exceeded even the normal dramatic changes associated with Space Marine enhancement. The growing recognition of the Badab sector's autonomy by neighboring regions represented another crucial development in the emergence of what would eventually become open rebellion. Trade agreements negotiated directly between the War Council and other sectors, bypassing Imperial commercial regulations entirely, demonstrated that Huron's government possessed not just military strength but economic legitimacy as well. Diplomatic missions from other frontier regions arrived on Badab Primaris seeking advice and cooperation on governance issues, effectively treating the sector as an independent political entity rather than a rogue Imperial province. The Adeptus Terra's initial response to these developments revealed both the bureaucratic inertia that plagued Imperial government and the difficulty of formulating policy for unprecedented situations. Traditional procedures for dealing with rogue Imperial officials or corrupt planetary governors provided no guidance for addressing a Space Marine chapter that had effectively seceded from Imperial authority while maintaining technical compliance with most Codex Astartes requirements. The legal and theological implications of the situation were staggering, raising fundamental questions about the nature of Space Marine loyalty and the limits of Imperial authority over the Adeptus Astartes. As 902.M41 dawned across the Badab sector, the transformation that had begun with practical governance reforms had evolved into something far more significant and dangerous. The Astral Claws had become the de facto rulers of an independent stellar nation, complete with allied military forces, economic partnerships, and political recognition from other regions. What had started as Lufgt Huron's attempt to better protect his assigned sector had grown into a fundamental challenge to the entire structure of Imperial civilization. a precedent that threatened to inspire similar movements across the galaxy and potentially fracture humanity's unity beyond any hope of repair. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test not just military might, but the very philosophical foundations upon which the Imperium of Man had been built. The question was no longer whether the Badab sector could maintain its independence, but whether the Imperial authorities possessed the will and capability to prevent the spread of separatist sentiment to other regions where local leaders might be inspired by Huron's example to seek their own paths toward autonomy and self-determination. The true scope of the Astral Claws transformation from loyal Imperial servants to independent sector rulers became undeniably clear when the first Imperial tax collector flotilla arrived at the edges of Badab space in early 902.M41. What should have been a routine administrative visit to collect overdue tithes instead became a demonstration of military power that shocked Imperial observers and forever changed the nature of the growing crisis. The Adeptus Arbites enforcement vessels, accustomed to dealing with reluctant planetary governors and corrupt administrators, found themselves facing a coordinated fleet response that treated them not as representatives of legitimate authority but as unwelcome intruders in sovereign space. The destruction of the Arbites flotilla became the first documented act of open warfare between Imperial forces and the Badab Secessionists, though both sides would later dispute whether the engagement constituted legitimate self-defense or unprovoked aggression. Surviving records from the Arbites vessel Imperial Justice describe a coordinated attack by multiple Astral Claws strike cruisers that demonstrated tactical sophistication and strategic planning far beyond what any single Space Marine chapter should have possessed. The rebel forces employed advanced electronic warfare capabilities, sophisticated fleet coordination protocols, and most disturbing of all, detailed intelligence about Imperial ship movements that suggested extensive spy networks within the broader Imperial administration. The aftermath of this naval engagement provided Imperial intelligence analysts with their first concrete evidence of the scale and sophistication of the Secessionist alliance that Huron had been building in secret. Wreckage analysis revealed weapons modifications that incorporated technology from multiple Forge worlds, suggesting supply chains that extended far beyond the Badab sector itself. Communication intercepts captured during the battle referenced coordinated operations involving forces identified as Mantis Warriors, Executioners, and Lamenters elements, confirming that the rebellion involved multiple Space Marine chapters acting in concert rather than a single rogue force. Perhaps most alarming from an Imperial perspective was the evidence that local populations throughout the Badab sector had been systematically militarized and integrated into the rebellion's command structure. Civilian vessels modified for military operations participated in the engagement alongside traditional Space Marine ships, while planetary defense monitors demonstrated capabilities that rivaled Imperial Navy escort vessels. The rebels had created not just a military alliance but a complete alternative power structure capable of independent operation across multiple star systems simultaneously. The capture of several Imperial Navy vessels during subsequent engagements provided the Secessionists with both symbolic victories and practical military assets that dramatically enhanced their operational capabilities. The light cruiser Emperor's Wrath and the destroyer Righteous Fury were not simply destroyed but boarded, captured intact, and subsequently modified for rebel operations. These vessels, bearing Imperial Navy identification codes and equipped with legitimate authorization protocols, allowed Secessionist forces to operate throughout the region while maintaining the fiction of Imperial authority, creating confusion and delay that proved tactically invaluable. The execution of captured administrative officials marked a crucial psychological turning point in the rebellion's evolution from political resistance to open warfare. Huron's forces had previously limited themselves to detention and deportation of Imperial representatives, maintaining at least the pretense that their conflict was administrative rather than fundamental. The decision to begin treating Imperial officials as enemy combatants subject to summary execution represented a deliberate escalation that made reconciliation impossible and forced neutral observers throughout the galaxy to choose sides in what had become an existential struggle. The formal declaration of the Badab Compact in late 902.M41 represented Huron's most audacious political gambit, a document that attempted to provide legal and philosophical justification for actions that Imperial law could only classify as treason and heresy. The compact proclaimed the formation of an independent stellar government dedicated to the protection and advancement of human civilization free from the corruption and incompetence that plagued the broader Imperium. More provocatively, It explicitly rejected the authority of the High Lords of Terra while maintaining theoretical loyalty to the Emperor himself, attempting to separate the person of the God Emperor from the institutional structure that governed in his name. The philosophical arguments presented in the Badab Compact demonstrated sophisticated political thinking that went far beyond simple military rebellion. Huron and his advisors had crafted a comprehensive critique of imperial governance that identified specific failures in administration, military strategy, and resource allocation that they claimed justified their separation from imperial authority. The document cited statistical evidence of improved living conditions, reduced casualty rates, and enhanced defensive capabilities within their autonomous zone as proof that their alternative approach to governance produced superior outcomes for the populations they protected. The reaction from loyal Space Marine chapters to the Badab Compact's publication revealed the depth of division that the rebellion had created within the Adeptus Astartes. The Firehawks chapter, with a long history of cooperation with imperial authorities, immediately volunteered to lead punitive expeditions against the rebels. Their chapter master, Stibor Lazaria, publicly denounced the compact as heretical propaganda that violated the most sacred oaths binding all Space Marines to the Emperor's service. The Firehawks offered a spearhead military action against their fellow Astartes, demonstrated both their loyalty to imperial authority and their understanding that the rebellion threatened the entire foundation of Space Marine culture and tradition. The Red Scorpions chapter's response proved even more significant due to their reputation for absolute purity and devotion to imperial orthodoxy. Chapter Master Karib Kalm's declaration that the Astral Claws had forfeited their right to bear the Emperor's gene seed carried tremendous weight throughout the broader Space Marine community. The Red Scorpions began immediate mobilization procedures, calling in battle brothers from distant deployments and requesting permission to access their most sacred weapons and relics for what they characterized as a holy war to preserve the integrity of the Adeptus Astartes. The Imperial Navy's assignment of multiple battle groups to operations in and around the Badab sector represented the most significant military response to the rebellion thus far, demonstrating that Imperial authorities finally understood the scale of the threat they faced. Admiral Septimus Frowett of Battlefleet Ultima received orders to establish a comprehensive blockade of all secessionist-controlled systems while providing fire support for anticipated Space Marine operations against rebel positions. The naval assets assigned to what was officially designated Operation Judgment included ships of the line that had previously been committed to operations against major Xenos incursions, indicating the priority that Imperial High Command placed on resolving the Badab situation. The placement of the Minotaur's chapter on alert status represented perhaps the most ominous development from the perspective of the Secessionist alliance. Unlike other chapters that had volunteered for anti-rebel operations, the Minotaurs possessed a reputation for absolute ruthlessness and mysterious connections to the highest levels of Imperial authority. Their participation in the growing Imperial response suggested that the rebellion had attracted attention from elements within the Imperial government that preferred to operate beyond public scrutiny, forces that would not be constrained by traditional concerns about civilian casualties or proportional response. The coordination of rebel operations across multiple star systems simultaneously demonstrated organizational capabilities that exceeded what Imperial doctrine suggested any alliance of Space Marine chapters should possess. Synchronized attacks on Imperial outposts in 3 separate sectors, coordinated fleet movements that required precise timing across interstellar distances, and intelligence operations that penetrated secure Imperial facilities all indicated a level of strategic planning and operational sophistication that challenged fundamental assumptions about Space Marine capabilities and limitations. The involvement of civilian populations in active military operations represented another significant escalation in the rebellion's character and scope. Reports from Imperial reconnaissance missions described entire planetary populations mobilized for war production, with civilian manufacturing facilities converted to military purposes and ordinary citizens trained for combat operations. Most disturbing were accounts of civilian vessels conducting raids against Imperial shipping, suggesting that the rebellion had succeeded in creating popular enthusiasm for armed resistance that extended far beyond the Space Marine chapters themselves. The Secessionist Alliance's ability to maintain operational security, despite the scale of their preparations, revealed counterintelligence capabilities that impressed even Imperial intelligence professionals. Repeated attempts to infiltrate rebel command structures failed, while Secessionist agents demonstrated detailed knowledge of Imperial plans and dispositions. The rebels seemed to anticipate Imperial moves with uncanny accuracy, suggesting either exceptionally sophisticated intelligence networks or access to information sources that Imperial security services had failed to identify and neutralize. The modification and enhancement of captured Imperial equipment provided concrete evidence of the technological resources available to the rebellion. Weapons systems incorporating improvements that exceeded original Imperial specifications, armor configurations that demonstrated understanding of advanced metallurgy and protection systems, and communication equipment with capabilities that surpassed standard Imperial Navy installations all indicated access to Forge World expertise and advanced manufacturing capabilities that should have been beyond the reach of any rebellious force. The psychological impact of these early demonstrations of secessionist power extended far beyond their immediate military significance. Imperial commanders throughout the galaxy began receiving reports of increased unrest and independence movements in regions previously considered completely loyal. The example of successful resistance to Imperial authority inspired separatist sentiment that manifested in everything from reduced cooperation with Imperial administrators to open defiance of taxation and recruitment demands. The precedent established by the Badab Rebellion threatened to encourage similar movements across the Imperium, potentially fragmenting human civilization in ways that would prove impossible to reverse. The establishment of alternative trade networks that bypassed Imperial commercial regulations demonstrated the economic implications of successful rebellion against Imperial authority. Forge worlds and manufacturing centers in sectors adjacent to Badab began establishing direct relationships with secessionist authorities, attracted by more favorable terms and reduced bureaucratic interference compared to traditional Imperial trade arrangements. These economic relationships created practical incentives for neutrality or even cooperation with the rebels that complicated Imperial efforts to maintain unified resistance to the spreading independence movement. As reports of secessionist capabilities and achievements reached Terra, the initial disbelief and confusion gave way to recognition that the Imperium faced a crisis unlike any in its 10,000-year history. This was not simply another rebellion by ambitious politicians or corrupt officials that could be resolved through traditional military and administrative measures. The Badab secessionists had demonstrated the capability to challenge Imperial authority on fundamental levels, creating alternative institutions and inspiring popular support that threatened the very foundations upon which human galactic civilization had been built. By the middle of 903.M41, the Secessionist Alliance had achieved something unprecedented in the 10,000-year history of the Imperium of mankind. 4 complete Space Marine chapters, supported by numerous auxiliary forces and commanding the absolute loyalty of billions of civilians across 18 star systems, had successfully established an independent stellar government that functioned with an efficiency and effectiveness that made many Imperial regions appear primitive by comparison. The achievement represented not just a military victory but a fundamental reimagining of how human civilization could organize itself in the grim darkness of the far future. The Astral Claws under Huron's leadership had grown far beyond their original 1,000 Marine limitation, reaching confirmed strength estimates of over 1,500 battle brothers, with some intelligence reports suggesting numbers approaching 2,000. This expansion had been achieved through revolutionary recruitment and training methods that accelerated the enhancement process while maintaining the quality standards that define true Space Marines. The chapter's apothecaries had developed techniques for genetic screening and enhancement that reduced the traditionally high failure rates of aspirant selection, allowing them to process larger numbers of candidates while minimizing the wastage that plagued conventional recruitment programs. The Mantis Warriors had committed their entire chapter strength to the secessionist cause, bringing not just military capability, but specialized expertise in stealth operations and reconnaissance that proved invaluable for Alliance intelligence activities. Their home world of Lufgt had become a center for training programs that shared advanced combat techniques among all Alliance forces, creating standardization and coordination that allowed mixed chapter task forces to operate with unprecedented effectiveness. The Mantis Warriors' reputation for honor and battlefield prowess lent credibility to secessionist claims that their rebellion represented principled resistance, rather than mere ambition or corruption. The Executioners chapter's participation brought heavy assault capabilities and siege warfare expertise that complemented the other Alliance forces perfectly. Their specialized equipment and tactical doctrines, developed through centuries of combat operations against the most formidable enemies of mankind, provided the Alliance with capabilities that rivaled those of entire Imperial battle groups. Most importantly, their philosophical commitment to the concept of Space Marine independence resonated throughout the Alliance, providing intellectual justification for actions that might otherwise have seemed like simple betrayal of sacred oaths. The Lamenters' involvement represented perhaps the most significant propaganda victory for the secessionist cause due to their tragic history of persecution and misfortune at the hands of Imperial authorities. Their reputation for self-sacrifice and nobility made their decision to join the rebellion particularly powerful evidence that the Alliance represented legitimate grievances against Imperial corruption and incompetence rather than personal ambition or heretical beliefs. The sight of Lamenters' battle brothers fighting alongside other secessionist forces provided visual proof that the rebellion enjoyed support from Marines whose loyalty to humanity's welfare had never been questioned. The combined naval assets under Alliance command represented a fleet capability that exceeded most sector battle groups and rivaled some segmentum fleets in raw fighting power. The captured Imperial vessels had been extensively modified and improved, incorporating technological innovations that enhanced their combat effectiveness beyond original Imperial specifications. More significantly, the Alliance had established independent shipyard facilities capable of constructing new vessels from captured resources and salvaged materials, creating a self-sustaining naval production capability that reduced their dependence on external suppliers. The technological achievements of the Alliance during this period demonstrated capabilities that impressed even hostile Imperial observers. Independent Forge World production facilities on multiple Alliance worlds churned out equipment that matched or exceeded Imperial standards in every measurable category. Weapons systems incorporating improvements over original Imperial designs, power armor configurations that provided enhanced protection and mobility, and communication networks with capabilities that surpassed those available to many Imperial forces, all testified to the technical expertise that Alliance leadership had managed to assemble and coordinate. The organizational structure that Huron had created to coordinate Alliance activities represented a masterpiece of military and political engineering. The War Council had evolved into a sophisticated governmental system that managed everything from resource allocation to diplomatic relations with neighboring sectors. Representatives from each Alliance chapter participated in decision-making processes that balanced military necessity against political considerations, creating policies that maximized combat effectiveness while maintaining popular support among the civilian populations under Alliance protection. The integration of civilian and military authority that characterized Alliance governance created efficiencies that even hostile Imperial analysts were forced to acknowledge. Crime rates across Alliance-controlled space fell to levels not seen since the legendary golden age of human expansion. Economic productivity reached heights that made neighboring Imperial sectors appear stagnant by comparison. Most importantly, the seamless coordination between Space Marine forces and civilian support networks created military capabilities that far exceeded what either could achieve independently under traditional Imperial organizational structures. The Palace of Thorns had grown into a fortress complex that rivaled the greatest Imperial installations in scope and defensive capability. The massive construction projects undertaken during this period created not just military facilities but symbols of Alliance power and permanence that inspired confidence among supporters and struck fear into potential enemies. Deep beneath the palace foundations, vast chambers served purposes that remain mysterious even to most Alliance members. Spaces equipped with technologies whose origins and functions would only become clear during the final confrontation that lay ahead. The Alliance's intelligence networks had achieved penetration of Imperial command structures that provided advance warning of enemy plans and dispositions. Agents throughout Imperial space transmitted information that allowed Alliance forces to anticipate and counter Imperial moves with remarkable accuracy. More troubling from an Imperial perspective were indications that Alliance intelligence operations extended to the highest levels of Imperial government, suggesting that the rebellion enjoyed support or at least sympathy from individuals whose positions should have guaranteed absolute loyalty to Imperial authority. The recruitment and training programs that had allowed Alliance forces to expand beyond traditional limitations represented perhaps their most significant long-term achievement. Revolutionary techniques for identifying suitable candidates, accelerated enhancement procedures that reduced the time required to create new battle brothers, and training regimens that produced Marines whose capabilities matched or exceeded traditional standards all indicated that the Alliance had solved fundamental problems that had constrained Space Marine expansion throughout Imperial history. The economic foundation that supported Alliance military operations demonstrated sustainable resource management that contrasted sharply with the extraction-based model that characterized Imperial economic policy in most sectors. Alliance worlds produced everything from basic foodstuffs to advance technology through integrated systems that maximized efficiency while minimizing waste. The result was an economic base capable of supporting military operations indefinitely, without the external supply lines upon which most Imperial forces depended for sustained operations. The diplomatic relationships that Alliance leadership had established with neighboring sectors created a network of sympathetic or at least neutral governments that complicated Imperial efforts to isolate and contain the rebellion. Trade agreements, mutual defense pacts, and cultural exchange programs had created practical incentives for cooperation with Alliance authorities that proved stronger than abstract loyalty to distant Imperial bureaucrats. These relationships provided the Alliance with strategic depth and economic resources that enhanced their ability to resist Imperial pressure while maintaining their independence. The popular support that Alliance governance had achieved among civilian populations represented perhaps their most significant strategic asset. Unlike traditional Imperial rebellions that relied primarily on coercion or exploitation of local grievances, the Secessionist Alliance had created genuine enthusiasm for their cause among the billions of ordinary citizens under their protection. Public rallies celebrating Alliance victories drew crowds whose enthusiasm appeared authentic rather than manufactured, while volunteer recruitment for civilian support roles consistently exceeded requirements. The military innovations developed by Alliance forces during this period included tactical doctrines and operational procedures that revolutionized space marine warfare, combined arms tactics that integrated different chapter specialties, coordination protocols that allowed rapid redeployment of forces across multiple star systems, and intelligence sharing procedures that maximized situational awareness all represented advances over traditional Imperial military doctrine. These innovations provided Alliance forces with significant advantages over Imperial opponents trained according to older, less flexible methodologies. The cultural and spiritual developments within Alliance territory created a sense of identity and purpose that transcended simple political rebellion. Alliance worlds celebrated their independence through festivals and ceremonies that emphasized local traditions while maintaining respect for broader human heritage. The result was a unique civilization that combined the best aspects of Imperial culture with innovations that addressed specific regional needs and circumstances. Yet, beneath these impressive achievements, subtle signs of strain were beginning to manifest within the Alliance structure. The rapid expansion that had created their current strength also generated logistical pressures that tested even their sophisticated organizational systems. Coordination between forces from different chapters occasionally revealed philosophical differences that had been suppressed but not resolved during the excitement of early victories. Most ominously, the accelerated recruitment and enhancement procedures that had enabled their growth sometimes produced side effects that concerned even Alliance medical specialists. The isolation from broader Imperial civilization that accompanied independence created cultural and technological stagnation that became more apparent as time passed. Despite their impressive achievements, Alliance worlds began to lose access to innovations and discoveries from other regions of the galaxy, creating subtle but cumulative disadvantages that would become significant during prolonged conflict. The price of independence was proving higher than Alliance leadership had anticipated, even as their immediate success continued to inspire confidence and determination among their followers. As 904.M41 dawned across Alliance space, the Secessionist Alliance had achieved the remarkable feat of creating a functioning alternative to Imperial civilization. However, the very success of their rebellion was attracting attention and inspiring responses that would soon test whether their achievements could withstand the full weight of Imperial opposition determined to prevent the precedent of successful rebellion from inspiring similar movements throughout the galaxy. The success of the Badab Secessionist Alliance sent ripples of unrest across the galaxy that Imperial authorities had neither anticipated nor prepared to address. What had begun as a localized rebellion in a distant frontier sector was transforming into something far more dangerous, a philosophical challenge to the very foundations of Imperial unity that threatened to inspire similar movements in regions where local leaders chafed under the burden of distant oversight and seemingly arbitrary demands from Terra. The concept of space marine autonomy, once unthinkable, was beginning to take root in minds that had previously accepted Imperial authority as both natural and inevitable. Reports from across the Ultima Segmentum documented increasing incidents of defiance and resistance to Imperial directives, ranging from minor delays in tithe payments to outright refusal to comply with administrative requests for military support. Planetary governors, who had once competed to demonstrate their loyalty to Imperial authority, began expressing private doubts about the wisdom of policies that seemed designed more to enrich distant bureaucrats than to protect the populations they governed. Most troubling to Imperial security services were indications that these expressions of dissatisfaction were being coordinated through communication networks that bypassed official Imperial channels entirely. The philosophical foundations underlying the secessionist movement proved particularly attractive to frontier regions, where the practical benefits of Imperial membership had long been overshadowed by its costs and restrictions. Huron's doctrine of local protection and self-determination resonated powerfully with populations who had watched their resources flow toward Terra while receiving minimal support during times of crisis. The concept that effective governance required intimate knowledge of local conditions and direct accountability to those being governed challenged Imperial orthodoxy in ways that proved difficult for traditional authorities to counter effectively. The Mantis Warriors' complete embrace of the secessionist cause provided compelling evidence that the rebellion represented more than simple ambition or corruption on the part of its leadership. Their homeworld of Oathaka had become a showcase for alternative approaches to Imperial governance, demonstrating that Space Marine rule could produce results superior to traditional Imperial administration. Visiting delegations from other sectors returned home with accounts of efficient resource allocation, reduced crime rates, and enhanced defensive capabilities that made their own regions appear backward and poorly managed by comparison. Agricultural productivity on Alliance worlds had increased by measurable percentages compared to Imperial averages, while industrial output reached levels that attracted attention from Forge worlds seeking more reliable suppliers for essential materials. Educational systems that combined practical training with broader cultural development produced populations whose technical competence and civic engagement exceeded what most Imperial worlds achieved through traditional indoctrination programs. Most significantly, military recruitment programs that emphasized voluntary service and personal commitment generated forces whose morale and effectiveness surpassed that of typical Imperial Guard regiments. The Executioners chapter's participation in Alliance activities brought legitimacy that proved crucial for convincing other Space Marine forces that the rebellion represented principled resistance rather than heretical betrayal. Their reputation for tactical excellence and unwavering commitment to human welfare made their decision to join the Secessionists a powerful argument for the movement's moral authority. When Executioners' battle brothers spoke publicly about their reasons for supporting Alliance goals, their words carried weight that no amount of Imperial propaganda could effectively counter. The response from other Space Marine chapters revealed deep divisions within the Adeptus Astartes that Imperial authorities had either failed to recognize or chosen to ignore. While some chapters immediately declared their opposition to the rebellion and volunteered for anti-secessionist operations, others adopted positions of cautious neutrality that suggested sympathy for Alliance goals, even if they were unwilling to commit to open rebellion. Most disturbing to Imperial High Command were reports of informal discussions between chapter masters about the proper relationship between Space Marines and Imperial bureaucracy, conversations that indicated widespread dissatisfaction with current arrangements. The Imperial Navy's assignment of additional battle groups to operations around Badab space demonstrated recognition that the rebellion had grown beyond the scope of local security issues into a galactic strategic concern. Admiral Cornelius Thorne of Battlefleet Solar received orders to establish forward operating bases in sectors adjacent to Alliance territory, creating staging areas for potential large-scale military operations, while simultaneously demonstrating Imperial resolve to resist the spread of separatist sentiment. These deployments represented the largest concentration of Imperial naval power in the region since the aftermath of major Xenos incursions, indicating the priority that Imperial authorities placed on containing the rebellion before it could inspire additional defections. The Administratum's efforts to tighten control over regions showing signs of secessionist sympathy created bureaucratic pressure that often proved counterproductive, alienating local officials who might otherwise have remained loyal while providing ammunition for Alliance propaganda about Imperial heavy-handedness. Increased surveillance and reduced autonomy for planetary governors generated resentment that manifested in everything from passive resistance to active sabotage of Imperial operations. The heavy-handed response to dissent created the very conditions that secessionist recruiters exploited most effectively, confirming Alliance claims about Imperial authoritarianism and corruption. Trade relationships between Alliance territory and neighboring sectors created economic incentives that complicated Imperial efforts to maintain unified resistance to the rebellion. Forge Worlds and manufacturing centers discovered that direct negotiations with alliance authorities produced more favorable terms and reduced bureaucratic interference compared to traditional imperial commercial arrangements. These economic relationships generated powerful constituencies for continued cooperation with the secessionists that proved resistant to imperial pressure and created practical dependencies that would be costly and difficult to sever. The intelligence networks that had enabled alliance success began operating beyond their original territorial boundaries, establishing contact with sympathetic elements throughout imperial space, and providing coordination for resistance activities that had previously been isolated and ineffective. Reports from Imperial Security Services documented increased communication between separatist groups across multiple sectors, suggesting that the alliance was actively working to expand their influence through ideological rather than purely military means. The transformation from local rebellion to galactic movement represented an escalation that imperial authorities were unprepared to address through conventional military responses. Civilian populations throughout regions adjacent to Alliance territory began comparing their living conditions unfavorably to accounts of life under secessionist governance. Alliance worlds reported economic growth, improved security, and enhanced personal freedoms that contrasted sharply with the stagnation and oppression that characterized much of imperial space. When Alliance representatives spoke at unofficial gatherings about their experiences with alternative forms of governance, their audiences included imperial citizens whose loyalty had previously been considered unshakable, but who were beginning to question whether current arrangements truly served their interests. The coordination problems that plagued imperial responses to the growing crisis revealed fundamental weaknesses in imperial command structures that alliance strategists exploited with devastating effectiveness. The compartmentalization and bureaucratic rivalry that prevented different imperial agencies from sharing information or coordinating activities allowed alliance intelligence operations to exploit gaps and contradictions in imperial security arrangements. Meanwhile, the unity of command and clarity of purpose that characterized alliance organization enabled rapid responses to changing conditions that consistently outmaneuvered slower imperial decision-making processes. Military recruitment in sectors showing secessionist sympathy began experiencing difficulties that reflected changing popular attitudes toward imperial service. Young people who might previously have competed for selection to Imperial Guard regiments or Navy service now questioned whether such service represented genuine contribution to human welfare or mere support for corrupt and distant authorities. The decline in recruitment quality and quantity forced Imperial military commanders to rely increasingly on conscription and coercion, methods that generated additional resentment and provided further evidence for Alliance claims about Imperial authoritarianism. Religious and cultural movements that emphasized local traditions and regional identity gained strength throughout imperial space, as populations sought alternatives to the homogenizing influence of imperial orthodoxy. While these movements maintained theoretical loyalty to the emperor, their emphasis on local autonomy and self-determination echoed themes that alliance propagandists had been promoting with increasing effectiveness. Imperial authorities struggled to suppress these movements without appearing to validate alliance criticisms about imperial intolerance for diversity and local governance. The technological innovations developed within alliance territory began spreading to other regions through informal networks that bypassed official imperial technology transfer protocols. Improved manufacturing techniques, enhanced communication systems, and more efficient resource allocation methods all found their way into sectors where local administrators were willing to experiment with alternatives to traditional imperial approaches. This technological diffusion created practical benefits that generated support for continued cooperation with alliance sources while reducing dependence on imperial suppliers and expertise. Diplomatic missions from alliance territory began appearing in sectors throughout the galaxy, officially conducting trade negotiations but actually spreading alliance ideology and establishing contact networks that could support future expansion of secessionist influence. These missions operated within the bounds of established diplomatic protocol while pursuing objectives that fundamentally challenged imperial unity and authority. Imperial security services found themselves unable to prevent these activities without violating diplomatic conventions that they had previously used to their own advantage in other contexts. The precedent established by successful resistance to imperial authority encouraged independence movements that had previously remained dormant or ineffective due to isolation and lack of external support. Planetary governors, who had chafed under imperial restrictions, began establishing direct communication with alliance representatives, seeking advice and support for their own resistance activities. Regional coalitions formed around shared grievances against imperial policies, creating networks of mutual support that enhanced the capacity for sustained resistance to imperial pressure. Cultural exchange programs between alliance worlds and sympathetic populations in other sectors created personal relationships and emotional bonds that transcended political boundaries and ideological differences. Citizens who had experienced alliance hospitality and witnessed alternative approaches to governance returned to their homeworlds as advocates for change who could speak from personal experience about the benefits of secessionist policies. These informal ambassadors proved more effective than official alliance propaganda in convincing others that rebellion against imperial authority represented realistic hope for improved conditions rather than impossible idealism. The religious implications of the secessionist movement proved particularly troubling to imperial authorities, as alliance territories developed forms of emperor worship that emphasized local interpretation and personal relationship with the divine, rather than submission to distant ecclesiastical authority. While these practices maintained theoretical orthodoxy, their emphasis on individual spiritual development and community-based religious expression challenged the hierarchical control that the Adeptus Ministorum exercised throughout imperial space. The spread of these alternative religious practices created additional venues for resistance to imperial authority, while making suppression difficult without appearing to attack genuine faith and devotion. Beneath the surface of military triumph and political success that characterized the secessionist alliance during its golden age, subtle anomalies were beginning to manifest that would eventually reveal the true cost of rebellion against imperial authority. The first signs appeared so gradually and seemed so insignificant that even experienced observers dismissed them as natural variations in frontier conditions rather than evidence of fundamental corruption taking root in the heart of the alliance's power structure. What began as minor irregularities in patrol reports and administrative communications would eventually grow into revelations that shattered the philosophical foundations upon which the entire rebellion had been built. The proximity of the Badab sector to the Maelstrom had always presented challenges that required constant vigilance and specialized defensive measures. This massive warp storm, one of the largest permanent disturbances in real space outside the Eye of Terror itself, generated reality fluctuations and dimensional instabilities that affected everything from navigation systems to human psychology throughout the surrounding region. The Astral Claws had built their reputation partially on their expertise in managing these threats, developing techniques and technologies that allowed normal human activity to continue despite the constant pressure of chaotic influence pressing against the barriers between dimensions. However, intelligence reports from late 904.M41 began documenting changes in the pattern and intensity of Maelstrom-related incidents that suggested something more than natural variation in warp storm activity. Astral Claws patrol vessels reported navigation anomalies in regions where their instruments had previously functioned reliably for decades. Communication blackouts occurred with increasing frequency, affecting not just long-range astropathic transmissions but short-range Vox networks that should have been immune to warp interference. Most troubling were accounts from civilian populations describing atmospheric disturbances and unusual stellar phenomena that seemed to cluster around areas of highest Alliance military activity. The Palace of Thorns, that magnificent fortress monastery that served as both symbol and center of Alliance power, began experiencing what official reports characterized as technical difficulties, but which survivor accounts would later describe in far more disturbing terms. Maintenance crews reported sections of the palace that seemed to change configuration between inspection visits, corridors that appeared longer or shorter than architectural plans indicated, and chambers where temperature and atmospheric readings defied rational explanation. The advanced sensory equipment that monitored the palace's vast underground complexes registered energy signatures that matched no known Imperial technology, while automated security systems occasionally activated without apparent cause or external trigger. The accelerated recruitment and enhancement procedures that had enabled the Alliance's military expansion began producing side effects that concerned even Alliance medical specialists. Aspirants who underwent the enhanced transformation process occasionally displayed behavioral changes that went beyond the normal psychological adaptation to Space Marine enhancement. Some candidates exhibited heightened aggression that manifested in difficulty controlling violent impulses during training exercises. Others demonstrated unusual resistance to standard conditioning techniques, requiring modified approaches that Alliance apothecaries developed through trial and error rather than established medical doctrine. Reports from Alliance chaplains revealed disturbing trends in the spiritual condition of battle brothers who had undergone the accelerated enhancement procedures. Traditional meditation and prayer practices that had sustained Space Marine spiritual health for millennia proved less effective for Marines who had experienced the modified transformation process. Some battle brothers reported dreams and visions that departed significantly from conventional religious experiences, while others demonstrated reduced responsiveness to standard spiritual counseling techniques. The Alliance's religious leadership found themselves developing new approaches to spiritual care that diverged increasingly from established Imperial ecclesiastical practice. Intelligence gathering operations that had provided the Alliance with crucial advantages over Imperial forces began yielding information through methods that troubled even Alliance security specialists. Agents reported successful penetration of Imperial facilities through techniques that seemed to rely more on intuition and unusual insight than traditional intelligence training. Communication intercepts contained information that appeared to have been obtained through means that exceeded known technological capabilities, while surveillance operations sometimes produced intelligence about Imperial activities that had not yet occurred when the reports were filed. The enhanced coordination between Alliance forces that had been a hallmark of their military success began exhibiting characteristics that went beyond conventional tactical communication and strategic planning. Battle brothers from different chapters reported shared tactical awareness that allowed unprecedented coordination during combat operations, but also described experiences of collective consciousness during high-stress situations that had no precedent in Space Marine military doctrine. Some veterans expressed concern that their individual identity was becoming submerged in group consciousness that felt both powerful and somehow alien to their normal psychological state. Civilian populations throughout Alliance territory began reporting experiences that local authorities initially dismissed as stress-related hallucinations or the psychological effects of living in a war zone. Citizens described dreams that seemed unusually vivid and frequently involved themes of transformation and liberation from traditional constraints. Some reported enhanced physical capabilities that allowed them to perform tasks that should have been beyond normal human limits. Most disturbing were accounts of individuals who claimed to receive guidance and inspiration through means they could not rationally explain, but which consistently proved accurate and beneficial. The modification and enhancement of captured Imperial equipment had proceeded beyond simple improvement of existing systems to incorporate technologies whose origins Alliance technical specialists could not adequately explain. Weapons systems demonstrated capabilities that exceeded theoretical performance parameters, while defensive installations showed resilience that defied conventional understanding of materials science and engineering principles. Some equipment appeared to adapt automatically to changing conditions without conscious control or programming modifications, suggesting autonomous capabilities that had not been designed into the original systems. Alliance intelligence networks had achieved penetration of Imperial command structures that provided information access at levels that should have been impossible through conventional espionage techniques. Agents seemed to anticipate Imperial plans before they were formally approved, while communication intercepts contained details about classified operations that had been discussed only in the most secure Imperial facilities. The accuracy and scope of Alliance intelligence gathering exceeded what any known surveillance technology could achieve, suggesting capabilities that Imperial security services could neither understand nor counter effectively. The economic foundation that supported Alliance military operations had grown beyond sustainable resource management to incorporate productivity improvements that defied conventional understanding of industrial capacity and efficiency. Manufacturing facilities produced output that exceeded theoretical maximums based on available resources and workforce capabilities, while mining operations extracted materials in quantities that geological surveys suggested should have been impossible. Quality control systems detected no evidence of corner cutting or safety compromises, yet production levels continued to increase beyond what established industrial science indicated was achievable. The popular enthusiasm that Alliance governance had generated among civilian populations began manifesting in ways that troubled even Alliance political specialists. Public rallies and demonstrations of support exhibited coordination and unity that seemed to emerge spontaneously without organized planning or leadership direction. Citizens displayed knowledge of Alliance policies and military operations that exceeded what official information releases should have provided, while their expressions of loyalty demonstrated emotional intensity that appeared to transcend normal political enthusiasm and approach religious fervor. Agricultural productivity increases throughout Alliance territory had surpassed what improved farming techniques and resource allocation could reasonably explain. Crop yields exceeded historical maximums despite weather conditions that should have reduced harvests, while livestock reproduction rates increased beyond normal biological parameters. Soil analysis revealed mineral content and fertility levels that geological surveys had not detected during previous assessments, suggesting either significant oversight in earlier research or fundamental changes in environmental conditions that existing science could not adequately explain. Military innovations developed by Alliance forces incorporated tactical concepts and operational procedures that seemed to emerge fully formed, rather than through the gradual development process that characterized normal military evolution. Combat techniques appeared simultaneously among units that had no direct communication or shared training experiences, while strategic insights materialized among commanders who lacked the background knowledge or experience that should have been necessary for such advanced understanding. The source of these innovations remained unclear even to Alliance leadership, creating questions about the origins of their military advantages. The cultural and spiritual developments within Alliance territory had evolved beyond mere rejection of Imperial orthodoxy to embrace practices and beliefs that incorporated elements from sources that Alliance religious specialists could not identify or explain. Traditional emperor worship continued but was supplemented by rituals and ceremonies that seemed to emerge spontaneously among different populations without central coordination or historical precedent. These practices demonstrated remarkable consistency across different worlds and cultures, suggesting common influences that operated below the level of conscious awareness. Communication systems throughout Alliance space began exhibiting capabilities that exceeded their design specifications and theoretical limitations. Astropathic transmissions achieved clarity and range that surpassed what established psychic science indicated was possible, while conventional Vox networks maintained functionality under conditions that should have caused complete system failure. Most puzzling were reports of communication success between locations that had no established technical connection, suggesting data transmission through means that existing technology could neither achieve nor detect. The isolation from broader Imperial civilization that accompanied Alliance independence created opportunities for cultural and technological development that departed increasingly from Imperial norms and traditions. Without oversight from Imperial authorities or pressure to conform to established practices, Alliance populations began exploring approaches to governance, technology, and social organization that incorporated insights and techniques whose origins remained unclear even to those who implemented them most successfully. Alliance leadership found themselves managing developments that exceeded their conscious planning and control, creating benefits that enhanced their military and political position, while raising questions about the true source and ultimate cost of their advantages. The success that had validated their rebellion against Imperial authority was revealing itself to be founded upon influences and capabilities that operated according to principles that diverged significantly from established Imperial understanding of how reality functioned and what limitations governed human achievement. The Imperial response to the growing secessionist threat had been hampered by disbelief, bureaucratic inertia, and the unprecedented nature of a rebellion led by Space Marines themselves. However, by 905, Men 41, the scale and sophistication of the Alliance's challenge to Imperial authority had finally galvanized the normally ponderous Imperial war machine into decisive action. What emerged was a coordinated military response of staggering scope, involving multiple Space Marine chapters, entire Imperial Navy battle groups, and support elements drawn from across the galaxy. The Loyalist forces that began converging on the Badab sector represented the largest concentration of Imperial military power assembled for internal security operations in over a millennium. The Firehawks chapter had volunteered immediately upon learning of the rebellion, driven by their unwavering loyalty to Imperial authority and their horror at the concept of Space Marines turning against their sacred oaths. Chapter Master Stibor Lazarea had declared the Badab situation a holy war that demanded the participation of every loyal Astartes, viewing the rebellion not as a political dispute but as a fundamental threat to everything the Space Marines represented. The Firehawks' rapid mobilization and deployment to the theater of operations demonstrated their commitment to resolving the crisis through overwhelming force applied with surgical precision. Their initial encounters with secessionist forces revealed both the scope of the challenge facing loyal Imperial forces and the sophisticated military capabilities that the Alliance had developed during their years of independence. Firehawk's reconnaissance elements attempting to establish observation posts on the periphery of Alliance space found themselves engaged by enemy forces that demonstrated tactical awareness and coordination far exceeding standard Space Marine doctrine. The rebels employed advanced electronic warfare capabilities that disrupted communication networks, sophisticated sensor systems that provided early warning of loyalist movements, and most troubling of all, detailed intelligence about Firehawk's operational procedures and equipment specifications. The Red Scorpions chapter brought to the Loyalist response a reputation for absolute purity and devotion to Imperial orthodoxy that made their participation both symbolically important and tactically valuable. Chapter Master Carib Cohn's declaration that the Astral Claws had forfeited their right to bear the Emperor's gene seed carried tremendous weight throughout the broader Space Marine community, providing moral authority for military action against fellow Astartes. The Red Scorpions' specialized equipment and fanatical dedication to eliminating corruption made them particularly well suited for operations against enemies who might have been tainted by heretical influences. Their assault operations against secessionist outposts and supply lines demonstrated the devastating effectiveness of Loyalist forces when properly coordinated and supplied. Red Scorpion strike teams successfully eliminated several Alliance forward operating bases, capturing intelligence that revealed the extent of Alliance military capabilities and organizational structure. However, these victories came at costs that exceeded initial projections, as secessionist defenders fought with skill and determination that matched anything in Loyalist experience while demonstrating tactical innovations that conventional Imperial doctrine had not anticipated. The Imperial Navy's assignment of multiple battle groups to Operation Purge represented the most significant commitment of naval resources to internal security operations in Imperial history. Admiral Lysander Cornelius of Battle Fleet Ultima received authority to requisition vessels and personnel from other fleet commands, creating a combined force that included ships of the line normally reserved for operations against major Xenos incursions or chaos invasions. The naval assets committed to the Badab operations included battle cruisers, cruiser squadrons, destroyer flotillas, and support vessels that collectively represented firepower sufficient to devastate entire star systems. The establishment of comprehensive blockade operations around Alliance-controlled space required coordination between multiple fleet elements operating across vast interstellar distances while maintaining communication security that prevented secessionist intelligence from anticipating Loyalist movements. The blockade's success in disrupting Alliance supply lines and isolating rebel territory from potential external support demonstrated Imperial naval superiority while creating economic pressure that Alliance leadership had not fully anticipated during their planning for extended conflict. The Minotaur's chapter's deployment to the theater represented perhaps the most ominous development from the perspective of Alliance leadership. Unlike other Loyalist forces that had volunteered for anti-rebel operations, the Minotaurs possessed mysterious connections to the highest levels of Imperial authority and a reputation for absolute ruthlessness in pursuing their objectives. Their participation suggested that the rebellion had attracted attention from elements within the Imperial government that operated beyond conventional military and political structures, forces that would not be constrained by traditional concerns about civilian casualties or proportional response. The coordination of Loyalist operations across multiple star systems demonstrated organizational capabilities that Alliance intelligence had underestimated during their assessment of Imperial response capacity. Synchronized attacks on Alliance outposts, coordinated fleet movements that required precise timing across interstellar distances, and intelligence-sharing protocols that enabled rapid dissemination of tactical information all indicated that Imperial command structures possessed flexibility and adaptability that exceeded what Alliance strategists had calculated during their planning for extended resistance. The participation of multiple Imperial Guard regiments in support operations provided Loyalist forces with numerical superiority that gradually offset the qualitative advantages that Alliance forces had enjoyed during earlier phases of the conflict. While individual Imperial Guard units could not match Space Marine capabilities in direct combat, their availability for garrison duties, logistics support, and secondary operations allowed Loyalist Space Marine forces to concentrate on primary objectives without diluting their strength through peripheral missions. The integration of Adeptus Mechanicus technical specialists with Loyalist forces brought capabilities for electronic warfare, communication interception, and equipment analysis that proved crucial for countering Alliance technological advantages. Tech priests and technical adepts provided expertise for understanding and neutralizing Alliance equipment modifications, while developing countermeasures for rebel innovations that had previously given Alliance forces tactical superiority during engagements with Imperial forces. The psychological impact of facing coordinated opposition from multiple loyal Space Marine chapters began affecting Alliance morale and unit cohesion in ways that Alliance leadership had not anticipated. Battle brothers who had grown accustomed to fighting against poorly coordinated Imperial Guard units or individual Space Marine formations found themselves confronted by enemies whose capabilities matched their own while possessing numerical superiority and better supply lines. The realization that their rebellion had inspired unified opposition from the broader Space Marine community created doubts about the righteousness of their cause that had not existed during earlier phases of the conflict. Civilian populations throughout Alliance territory began experiencing the reality of total war as Loyalist forces adopted increasingly aggressive tactics designed to disrupt rebel support networks and eliminate potential sources of intelligence or logistical assistance. Orbital bombardments of suspected military targets often caused collateral damage to civilian infrastructure, while special operations raids against communication facilities and transportation hubs created shortages of essential supplies that affected non-combatant populations throughout Alliance space. The effectiveness of Loyalist intelligence operations gradually eroded Alliance advantages in information gathering and operational security that had been crucial for their early successes. Imperial intelligence services, coordinating through Inquisition oversight, developed techniques for identifying and neutralizing Alliance spy networks while establishing their own intelligence gathering capabilities within rebel territory. The loss of information superiority forced Alliance commanders to adopt more defensive postures that reduced their ability to exploit tactical opportunities and maintain operational initiative. The technological superiority that Alliance forces had enjoyed through their equipment modifications and manufacturing innovations began to erode as Loyalist forces adapted their tactics and developed countermeasures for rebel advantages. Imperial technical specialists analyzed captured Alliance equipment to understand their modifications and capabilities, while Forge World production facilities began developing improved systems specifically designed to counter rebel technological advantages. Alliance recruitment and training programs began experiencing difficulties maintaining quality and quantity standards as Loyalist operations disrupted their educational facilities and reduced access to suitable candidates. The accelerated enhancement procedures that had enabled Alliance expansion proved more vulnerable to interruption than traditional methods, while the specialized expertise required for their implementation became harder to maintain under combat conditions. The economic foundation that had supported Alliance independence came under increasing pressure as Loyalist blockade operations and targeted attacks on industrial facilities reduced productive capacity and disrupted trade relationships. Manufacturing centers that had previously operated at peak efficiency found themselves struggling to maintain output while diverting resources to defensive measures and emergency repairs, creating shortages of essential military supplies that affected Alliance operational capabilities. The coordination problems that Alliance forces began experiencing during multi-system operations revealed vulnerabilities in their command structure that Loyalist intelligence exploited with increasing effectiveness. Communication delays and coordination failures that had been minor issues during peacetime operations became serious tactical disadvantages during high-intensity combat situations where rapid response and precise timing were essential for mission success. Popular support for Alliance leadership began showing signs of strain as civilian populations experienced the hardships and dangers of sustained military conflict. Citizens who had enthusiastically supported the rebellion during its early phases of success found themselves questioning whether the benefits of independence justified the costs of war against the broader Imperium, creating political pressures that Alliance leadership had to address while simultaneously managing military operations against increasingly effective opposition. The religious and cultural movements that had flourished during Alliance independence faced disruption and suppression as Loyalist operations targeted infrastructure and personnel associated with alternative forms of emperor worship and regional identity expression. The loss of cultural autonomy that had been one of the rebellion's most attractive features created resentment and resistance that complicated alliance efforts to maintain civilian cooperation and support for continued military operations. The mounting pressure from coordinated Imperial forces throughout 906.mem41 forced the Secessionist alliance into a series of increasingly desperate measures that would ultimately reveal the true nature of their rebellion and the price they had unknowingly agreed to pay for their independence. What had begun as principled resistance to Imperial corruption transformed into something far darker as Alliance leadership abandoned the very ideals they had claimed to defend in their struggle to survive against overwhelming odds. The decisions made during this crucial period would forever stain the legacy of the rebellion and provide justification for the brutal suppression that followed. The Codex Astartes, that sacred text that had guided Space Marine doctrine for 10 millennia, became the first casualty of Alliance desperation, as commanders threw aside established tactical principles in favor of methods that promised immediate results regardless of long-term consequences. Traditional Space Marine warfare emphasized honor, precision, and protection of civilian populations even during the most desperate circumstances. Alliance forces began adopting tactics that deliberately targeted non-combatants, used civilian infrastructure as shields for military operations, and employed weapons in ways that violated every principle of honorable warfare that had defined the Adeptus Astartes since their creation. The rules of engagement that had governed Space Marine operations since the Great Crusade were systematically abandoned as Alliance commanders authorized actions that would have been considered war crimes under any other circumstances. Captured Loyalist personnel were subjected to interrogation techniques that exceeded the bounds of acceptable treatment, while civilian populations suspected of providing intelligence to Imperial forces faced collective punishment that violated fundamental human rights. Most disturbing were reports of Alliance forces executing prisoners who refused to provide information or convert to the Secessionist cause, abandoning the mercy and protection that Space Marines traditionally extended even to their enemies. The sacred oaths that bound every Space Marine to the Emperor's service came under direct attack as Alliance leadership began requiring formal renunciation of loyalty to Terra in favor of allegiance to local authorities and regional interests. Battle brothers who had spent decades or centuries defining their identity through service to the God Emperor found themselves pressured to abandon the core beliefs that had sustained them through countless battles and hardships. The psychological trauma of oath-breaking created casualties that no amount of medical treatment could heal, as Marines struggled with the spiritual consequences of betraying vows they had considered more important than life itself. Chapter traditions and customs that had been preserved for millennia faced systematic modification or elimination, as Alliance authorities attempted to create new identities and loyalties that would override ancient bonds to Imperial service. Sacred rituals were altered to emphasize local rather than Imperial themes, while historic ceremonies were abandoned in favor of innovations that reflected Alliance ideology, rather than traditional Space Marine culture. The destruction of cultural continuity created psychological instability among battle brothers who found themselves adrift without the anchor points that had previously defined their existence and purpose. The accelerated recruitment programs that had enabled Alliance expansion were pushed beyond all reasonable safety limits, as desperate commanders sought to replace mounting casualties with new warriors regardless of the risks involved. The enhanced transformation procedures that had already shown troubling side effects were modified further to reduce processing time and increase success rates, creating Marines whose physical capabilities matched traditional standards but whose psychological stability remained questionable. The long-term consequences of these rushed enhancements would only become apparent during the final phases of the conflict when accumulated stress revealed the true cost of cutting corners in the sacred process of Space Marine creation. Gen Seed experimentation reached levels that would have horrified even the most radical Adeptus Mechanicus researchers as Alliance apothecaries attempted to enhance Space Marine capabilities beyond natural limits while reducing the time required for successful implantation. Ancient genetic templates that had remained unchanged since the Emperor's original design were modified using techniques that combined desperate innovation with technologies whose origins Alliance scientists could not adequately explain. The resulting enhancements provided temporary advantages that seemed to justify the risks, but also introduced genetic instabilities that would manifest in increasingly disturbing ways as the conflict progressed. The recovery and study of artifacts from the Maelstrom represented perhaps the most dangerous departure from Imperial orthodoxy as Alliance researchers sought technological advantages that might offset their numerical disadvantage against Loyalist forces. Objects that had been carefully sealed away or destroyed by previous Imperial expeditions were retrieved and analyzed using methods that prioritized immediate utility over long-term safety. The knowledge gained through these studies enabled significant improvements in Alliance weapons and equipment, but also exposed research personnel to influences that gradually corrupted their judgment and moral reasoning. Exploratory contacts with Xenos pirates and mercenaries marked the point where the Alliance's desperation overcame their fundamental humanity and Imperial identity. Negotiations with Eldar corsairs, Orc freebooters, and other alien forces that had previously been considered absolute enemies represented a betrayal of species loyalty that shocked even those Alliance members who had supported every previous departure from Imperial norms. The military advantages gained through these unholy alliances proved significant in several key engagements, but came at the cost of moral authority that had previously distinguished the secessionist cause from simple rebellion and banditry. The mutations that began manifesting among Astral Claws, Battle Brothers during this period, provided the first visible evidence of the supernatural corruption that had been growing within Alliance leadership since the rebellion's earliest days. What started as minor physical anomalies gradually evolved into changes that could not be dismissed as natural variation or the result of combat injuries. Enhanced strength and endurance that exceeded even Space Marine norms came accompanied by alterations in appearance and behavior that suggested influences operating beyond the bounds of normal human evolution. The Palace of Thorns underwent modifications during this period that transformed it from a fortress monastery into something that defied architectural understanding and challenged the sanity of those who witnessed its evolution. Chambers that had previously served conventional military and administrative functions were reconfigured according to designs that seemed to emerge from sources other than human engineering knowledge. The deep underground complexes that had been mysterious but apparently mundane facilities revealed purposes that became clear only when the final confrontation exposed the true nature of the power that Alliance leadership had embraced. Alliance leadership's responses to mounting casualties and strategic reversals revealed decision-making processes that increasingly departed from rational military planning in favor of approaches that seemed to emerge from intuition or inspiration whose source remained unclear. Battle plans that should have failed according to conventional tactical analysis proved surprisingly effective, while strategic decisions that appeared irrational at the time created advantages that became apparent only during their implementation. The source of this enhanced strategic insight remained mysterious even to Alliance commanders who benefited from its results. The integration of civilian populations into direct military operations reached levels that violated every principle of Space Marine warfare and Imperial military doctrine. Citizens who had previously provided logistical support and intelligence found themselves armed and deployed in combat roles for which they lacked training and equipment. The casualties among civilian combatants reached staggering proportions, but Alliance leadership justified these losses as necessary sacrifices for the greater goal of independence from Imperial tyranny. Recruitment practices expanded beyond traditional demographic boundaries to include candidates who would have been rejected under normal circumstances due to age, physical condition, or psychological profiles that suggested unsuitability for Space Marine enhancement. The desperate need for replacement personnel led to acceptance of volunteers whose motivation came more from personal grievance or opportunity for advancement than from genuine commitment to Alliance ideals. The resulting decline in unit cohesion and reliability created additional problems that Alliance leadership addressed through increasingly authoritarian control measures. The Alliance's industrial base came under extreme pressure to produce equipment and supplies at rates that exceeded safe operational parameters, while incorporating design modifications that pushed manufacturing capabilities beyond established limits. Factory workers labored under conditions that violated every safety protocol while producing weapons and equipment using techniques that relied more on trial and error than established engineering principles. The enhanced productivity that resulted from these efforts came at costs in human lives and environmental damage that Alliance authorities accepted as acceptable prices for continued resistance. Communication with Allied forces became increasingly difficult as traditional astropathic networks proved inadequate for coordinating operations across multiple star systems while maintaining operational security against Imperial intelligence gathering. Alternative communication methods that Alliance technicians developed demonstrated capabilities that exceeded known technological limitations, but also created dependencies on systems whose operation relied on principles that existing Imperial science could not explain or replicate. Medical treatment of wounded Alliance personnel began incorporating techniques and technologies that departed significantly from established Imperial medical practice, while achieving results that conventional healing methods could not match. Battle brothers who should have died from their injuries recovered with capabilities that exceeded their pre-injury condition, while psychological trauma that should have required extensive therapy resolved through treatments whose effectiveness seemed to operate through mechanisms that medical science could not adequately explain. The spiritual condition of Alliance forces deteriorated as traditional forms of Emperor worship proved inadequate for addressing the psychological pressures of fighting against fellow Space Marines while embracing alliances and methods that violated fundamental Imperial beliefs. Chaplains found themselves developing new religious practices that emphasized local rather than Imperial themes, while incorporating elements from sources that seemed to emerge spontaneously rather than through conscious theological development. Intelligence operations began yielding information through methods that exceeded conventional espionage capabilities, while creating dependencies on techniques that Alliance personnel could not fully understand or control. Agents reported success in penetrating Imperial facilities through approaches that seemed to rely more on supernatural insight than traditional training, while surveillance operations produced intelligence about enemy activities that conventional observation methods could not have obtained. The economic foundation that supported Alliance military operations came to depend increasingly on production and resource extraction methods that achieved results far exceeding normal industrial capacity, while operating according to principles that existing economic theory could not adequately explain. Manufacturing facilities produced output that defied conventional understanding of resource limitations and workforce capabilities, while mining operations extracted materials in quantities that geological science suggested should have been impossible. The revelation that would shatter the Secessionist alliance and expose the true nature of their rebellion began with whispered concerns among the Lamenters chapter leadership during the winter of 907.M41. Captain Malevolus of the Lamenters' Second Company had been conducting routine inspections of Alliance facilities when he encountered evidence that challenged everything he had believed about their righteous cause. What he discovered in the depths of Astral Claws installations would ultimately lead to the most painful decision in his chapter's tragic history: a choice between loyalty to their allies and loyalty to their souls. The Lamenters had joined the Secessionist alliance with genuine conviction that they were supporting a noble cause against Imperial corruption and bureaucratic incompetence. Their own bitter experiences with Imperial authorities who seemed determined to assign them the most dangerous and thankless missions had made them receptive to Huron's arguments about the need for Space Marine autonomy and local governance. However, the evidence that Captain Malevolus and his battle brothers uncovered suggested that their rebellion had been corrupted by influences far more sinister than mere political ambition or administrative reform. Deep within the Palace of Thorns, areas that had been declared off-limits even to Allied chapter personnel contained chambers that violated every principle of Imperial architecture and engineering. The Lamenters' reconnaissance teams reported walls covered with symbols that caused psychological distress to those who observed them directly, while atmospheric readings detected chemical compounds that had no place in any legitimate Space Marine facility. Most disturbing were the sounds that emanated from sealed chambers during certain hours, vocalizations that seemed to come from sources that were not entirely human. The accelerated recruitment facilities that had enabled the Astral Claws expansion beyond authorized limits revealed procedures that departed catastrophically from established Imperial medical practice. The Lamenters' medical specialists, who gained access to these areas, documented enhancement techniques that incorporated elements which bore unmistakable resemblance to forbidden practices that Imperial doctrine associated with chaos corruption. The genetic modifications being performed on new recruits included alterations that served no apparent military purpose while introducing changes that seemed designed to make the subjects more receptive to non-human influences. Intelligence reports that Alliance commanders had been receiving through their supposedly superior spy networks contained information that could only have been obtained through supernatural means rather than conventional espionage techniques. The Lamenters' own intelligence specialists recognized patterns in the intelligence that suggested sources operating beyond the normal bounds of human capability, while the accuracy and scope of the information exceeded what any known surveillance technology could achieve. The implications were terrifying for Marines whose training had emphasized the absolute necessity of maintaining spiritual purity against chaos corruption. The enhanced combat capabilities that Alliance forces had developed during their conflicts with Imperial forces proved to be the result of augmentations that drew upon powers whose source lay outside the bounds of acceptable Space Marine enhancement. Battle Brothers, who had undergone the modified training programs, displayed abilities that exceeded normal Astartes capabilities, but also exhibited behavioral changes that suggested psychological conditioning designed to make them more receptive to external influence and less capable of independent moral reasoning. Captain Malevolus's attempts to discuss his concerns with Alliance leadership revealed that the corruption had penetrated to the highest levels of command. Huron himself displayed knowledge and capabilities that could not be explained through conventional means, while his closest advisors demonstrated responses to questioning that suggested their judgment had been compromised by influences that operated below the level of conscious awareness. The Tyrant of Badab was no longer the principled warrior who had originally led the rebellion against Imperial corruption, but something far more dangerous and fundamentally alien to everything the Space Marines represented. The Mantis Warriors' leadership faced similar revelations when their own investigations into Alliance operations revealed evidence of systematic deception about the true nature of their rebellion. Chapter Master Devram Korda discovered that intelligence he had been receiving about Imperial atrocities and corruption contained deliberate fabrications designed to maintain Mantis Warriors' support for the Alliance while concealing the supernatural influences that were shaping Alliance policy and objectives. The realization that he had been manipulated into betraying his chapter's fundamental beliefs created a crisis of leadership that would ultimately fracture the Secessionist alliance beyond any hope of repair. The Executioner's chapter's discovery of chaos artifacts within Alliance weapons and equipment facilities provided undeniable proof that their rebellion had become something far removed from the principled resistance to Imperial bureaucracy that had originally motivated their participation. Chapter Master Thulsa Kane's investigation of Alliance supply chains revealed procurement of materials and technologies from sources that violated every principle of Imperial orthodoxy while serving purposes that had nothing to do with legitimate military operations against loyal Imperial forces. The sharing of this damning evidence between the Allied chapters created a crisis of conscience that exposed fundamental differences in how they understood their obligations as Space Marines and servants of the Emperor. The Lamenters, despite their own bitter experiences with Imperial persecution, could not reconcile continued participation in the Alliance with their duty to protect humanity from chaos corruption. Their chapter leadership made the agonizing decision to withdraw support from the rebellion and seek reconciliation with Imperial authorities, accepting whatever punishment might await them in exchange for the opportunity to redeem their honor. The internal intelligence networks that Alliance forces had developed to coordinate their operations became the means through which evidence of chaos corruption spread throughout rebel ranks, creating cascading failures in unit cohesion and command authority. Battle Brothers, who had accepted modifications to their equipment and enhancement procedures, began recognizing the true source of their improved capabilities when the evidence could no longer be denied or rationalized away. The psychological trauma of realizing they had been corrupted created mass breakdown in discipline and morale that no amount of charismatic leadership could overcome. The civilian populations throughout Alliance territory began experiencing manifestations of supernatural influence that could no longer be dismissed as stress-related phenomena or the psychological effects of living in a war zone. Citizens reported shared nightmares involving themes of transformation and submission to powers that promised liberation from traditional constraints in exchange for abandonment of human identity and independence. The popular enthusiasm that had sustained Alliance governance was revealed to be artificial, induced through subtle influences that operated below the level of conscious awareness. Huron's personal transformation accelerated dramatically once the Alliance's true nature began to be exposed, revealing changes that had been concealed through sophisticated deception and misdirection. The enhancements that had improved his physical capabilities and strategic insight proved to come from sources that violated every principle of Space Marine purity and Imperial orthodoxy. His closest supporters and advisors displayed similar changes that made clear their conversion to something that retained human appearance while serving purposes that were fundamentally hostile to human welfare and survival. The Palace of Thorns revealed its true purpose as reports from evacuating Alliance personnel described chambers that served functions related to communication with entities that existed beyond the normal bounds of reality. The deep underground complexes that had been constructed during the Alliance's Golden Age were revealed to be facilities designed for rituals and ceremonies that had nothing to do with legitimate Space Marine activities while serving to strengthen connections between Alliance leadership and powers whose ultimate objectives remained mysterious. but were clearly inimical to human civilization. The military advantages that Alliance forces had enjoyed throughout their rebellion were exposed as the result of supernatural assistance that came with prices that had been concealed from most Alliance personnel until the moment of revelation. The enhanced coordination, superior intelligence, and tactical innovations that had enabled their success against Imperial forces proved to be manifestations of influence from sources that demanded payment in the form of spiritual corruption and eventual surrender of human identity and independence. The economic miracles that had sustained Alliance independence and created prosperity throughout their territory were revealed to be temporary manifestations of supernatural manipulation designed to create dependency and eliminate resistance to gradual transformation of Alliance society, according to non-human objectives. The industrial productivity and resource abundance that had impressed even hostile Imperial observers proved to be unsustainable once their true source was understood and rejected by Alliance personnel, who retained enough spiritual integrity to recognize the nature of the bargain their leaders had made. The alternative forms of emperor worship that had flourished throughout Alliance territory were exposed as subtle corruptions designed to gradually shift religious focus away from the God Emperor toward entities whose objectives were fundamentally opposed to human welfare and Imperial survival. The spiritual practices that had seemed to emerge spontaneously among different Alliance populations proved to be coordinated manifestations of influence that operated through techniques that bypassed conscious resistance while achieving systematic corruption of religious belief and practice. The intelligence networks that had provided Alliance leadership with superior information about Imperial plans and dispositions were revealed to operate through communication with entities whose knowledge came from sources that violated the natural order and served purposes that were hostile to human civilization. The accuracy and scope of Alliance intelligence gathering proved to be the result of supernatural surveillance capabilities that came with obligations and prices that Alliance leadership had concealed from their followers until exposure became inevitable. The technological innovations that had given Alliance forces advantages over Imperial equipment and capabilities were exposed as applications of knowledge that originated from sources beyond human understanding, while serving purposes that ultimately threatened human survival and independence. The weapons, equipment, and manufacturing techniques that had enabled Alliance success proved to incorporate elements that violated Imperial orthodoxy while creating dependencies on powers whose ultimate objectives remained concealed but were clearly inimical to human welfare. The coordination failures and communication breakdowns that began affecting Alliance operations revealed the artificial nature of their previous unity and cooperation, as supernatural influences that had maintained discipline and morale were withdrawn or redirected toward other objectives. The psychological cohesion that had enabled Alliance forces to function effectively despite their diverse origins and competing interests proved to be externally imposed rather than naturally developed, creating immediate collapse once the external support was removed or recognized for what it truly represented. The revelation of chaos corruption at the heart of the Secessionist alliance triggered a catastrophic collapse that unfolded with terrifying speed across 18 star systems during the early months of 908.M41. What had taken years to build through careful planning and gradual expansion disintegrated within weeks as the psychological foundations that had held the rebellion together crumbled under the weight of betrayal, horror, and the terrible realization that their noble cause had been corrupted from its very inception. The Alliance's destruction came not from external Imperial pressure alone, but from the internal contradictions and spiritual poison that had been growing within its structure since the earliest days of the rebellion. The command structure that had coordinated Alliance operations across multiple star systems fragmented as different chapters and military units struggled to process the implications of what they had discovered about their leadership and objectives. The unified chain of command that had been one of the Alliance's greatest strengths dissolved into competing factions whose mutual suspicion and horror at their situation made coordinated resistance impossible. Officers who had worked together for years found themselves unable to trust subordinates or superiors whose loyalty might have been compromised by exposure to chaos influence. The Mantis Warriors faced perhaps the most agonizing decision of any Alliance chapter, as they confronted evidence that their participation in the rebellion had made them complicit in activities that violated everything they had sworn to defend. Chapter Master Devram Korda's attempts to maintain unit cohesion while processing the revelation of systematic deception created internal divisions that tore the chapter apart from within. Battle brothers who had followed orders without question found themselves questioning every decision they had made during their participation in the Alliance, while others refused to accept evidence that challenged their understanding of their cause and leadership. Supply lines that had sustained Alliance operations through sophisticated logistics networks began failing as personnel responsible for transportation and resource management abandoned their posts or actively sabotaged operations they now understood to be serving corrupt purposes. The civilian populations that had provided enthusiastic support for Alliance activities withdrew their cooperation as the artificial influences that had maintained their loyalty were exposed or failed. Manufacturing facilities that had operated beyond normal capacity during the Alliance's golden age suffered immediate breakdowns as supernatural assistance was withdrawn and normal physical limitations reasserted themselves. The evacuation of key personnel from Alliance installations created cascading failures throughout their territorial administration as individuals with crucial knowledge and expertise fled rather than remain associated with an organization they now understood to be fundamentally corrupted. The brain drain accelerated as reports spread throughout Alliance space about the true nature of their leadership and objectives, while those who remained often lacked the competence or authority to maintain essential services and operations. Strategic defensive positions that the Alliance had held for years were abandoned without meaningful resistance, as unit commanders concluded that their forces could not be trusted to fight effectively while processing the psychological trauma of learning about their corruption. Fortress worlds that should have required months or years to capture fell to Imperial forces within days as their defenders either fled or switched sides rather than continue supporting a cause they now recognized as fundamentally evil. The Executioner's chapter's attempts to redeem themselves through immediate action against chaos elements within Alliance territory created additional chaos and confusion as their operations interfered with evacuation efforts and complicated negotiations with Imperial forces. Chapter Master Thulsa, Kane's decision to begin hunting down and eliminating corrupted Alliance personnel created a civil war within the civil war that further accelerated the collapse of organized resistance, while providing Imperial forces with unexpected allies whose knowledge of Alliance capabilities proved invaluable. Naval assets that had given the Alliance strategic mobility and tactical flexibility either defected to Imperial forces or were destroyed by their own crews rather than allow them to continue serving corrupt purposes. The capture or destruction of Alliance fleet elements eliminated their ability to coordinate operations across multiple star systems while providing Imperial forces with detailed intelligence about Alliance capabilities and strategic planning. Most significantly, the loss of naval mobility trapped Alliance ground forces on individual worlds where they could be isolated and eliminated without affecting operations elsewhere. Communication networks that had enabled Alliance coordination and command authority suffered systematic failure as personnel responsible for maintaining astropathic and technological communication systems either fled or actively sabotaged equipment to prevent its use for corrupt purposes. The breakdown in communication created isolated pockets of Alliance resistance that could not coordinate their activities or receive updated intelligence about Imperial movements and intentions. Civilian populations throughout Alliance territory found themselves caught between competing forces as Imperial liberation efforts, Alliance resistance operations, and internal purges created multiple conflicts that made normal life impossible. The breakdown of civil authority that accompanied military collapse left entire worlds without effective governance, while their populations struggled to determine which authorities could be trusted, and which served corrupt purposes that threatened their spiritual and physical welfare. The industrial base that had supported Alliance independence experienced immediate collapse as workers and technical specialists abandoned facilities they now understood to be serving corrupt purposes, while Imperial forces targeted manufacturing capabilities to prevent their continued use by remaining Alliance forces. The destruction of production facilities eliminated the Alliance's ability to maintain and replace equipment, while forcing surviving resistance elements to rely on dwindling stockpiles of supplies and ammunition. Intelligence networks that had provided Alliance leadership with superior information about Imperial activities suffered complete breakdown as agents either defected to Imperial forces or were eliminated by their former allies who no longer trusted their loyalty or competence. The loss of intelligence capabilities left surviving Alliance forces operating blind while Imperial forces gained access to detailed information about Alliance defensive positions and remaining capabilities. The Lamenters' withdrawal from the Alliance created a cascading effect as other Alliance elements questioned their own participation while Imperial forces gained valuable intelligence about Alliance operations and weaknesses from a source whose credibility could not be questioned. The chapter's detailed reports about Alliance activities and organization provided Imperial commanders with information that proved crucial for planning final operations against remaining resistance. While their public renunciation of the Alliance undermined whatever moral authority the rebellion retained, fortress installations that had been the backbone of Alliance territorial defense were revealed to be compromised by chaos corruption that made their continued use impossible for forces that remained loyal to the Emperor. The discovery that defensive systems and fortifications incorporated elements that served corrupt purposes forced Alliance forces to abandon positions that should have been defensible while eliminating strategic assets that might have enabled continued resistance under other circumstances. The recruitment and training facilities that had enabled Alliance expansion were abandoned or destroyed as their corrupted nature became undeniable and their continued operation threatened the spiritual welfare of any personnel involved in their activities. The loss of recruitment capabilities eliminated any possibility of replacing casualties, while the destruction of training facilities left surviving Alliance forces without means of maintaining their combat effectiveness through continued education and skill development. Financial and economic systems that had sustained Alliance independence collapsed as the artificial influences that had maintained their enhanced productivity were withdrawn or redirected toward other purposes. The economic foundation that had enabled Alliance prosperity proved to be unsustainable once its supernatural sources were understood and rejected, creating immediate shortages of essential supplies and services that affected both military operations and civilian welfare. Medical facilities that had achieved remarkable success in treating Alliance casualties were abandoned as their techniques and technologies were revealed to incorporate elements that served corrupt purposes while threatening the spiritual welfare of patients and medical personnel. The loss of advanced medical capabilities created immediate problems for treating wounded Alliance personnel, while eliminating one of the advantages that had enabled Alliance forces to maintain their strength despite heavy casualties. Transportation networks that had enabled Alliance coordination and supply operations suffered systematic breakdown as the personnel responsible for their maintenance either fled or were eliminated by competing factions within the collapsing Alliance structure. The loss of transportation capabilities fragmented surviving Alliance forces while making coordinated resistance impossible and eliminating any possibility of strategic withdrawal to more defensible positions. Research and development programs that had provided Alliance forces with technological advantages were abandoned or destroyed as their corrupted nature became apparent, and their continued operation threatened the spiritual welfare of all personnel involved in their activities. The elimination of research capabilities ended any possibility of developing new capabilities to offset Imperial advantages, while ensuring that existing technological innovations could not be refined or improved to enhance their effectiveness. Cultural and educational institutions that had maintained Alliance identity and popular support collapsed as their role in spreading chaos corruption became understood, and their continued operation became impossible for personnel who retained spiritual integrity. The destruction of cultural institutions eliminated the ideological foundation that had sustained Alliance resistance while leaving surviving personnel without the shared identity and common purpose that had previously enabled effective cooperation despite their diverse origins. The Palace of Thorns itself became the center of a final desperate struggle, as remaining Astral Claws forces attempted to defend installations that they now understood to be thoroughly corrupted, while Huron's transformation into something no longer recognizably human accelerated beyond any possibility of concealment or reversal. The battles within the palace complex created additional destruction, while revealing the full extent of chaos corruption that had infected the heart of Alliance leadership and operations. The convergence of Loyalist forces upon Badab Primaris in the autumn of 912.M4-1 represented the largest concentration of Space Marine power assembled for combat operations since the darkest days of the Horus Heresy. The combined fleet that emerged from the warp at the edge of the Badab system included elements from 6 different chapters, supported by Imperial Navy battle groups whose firepower could reduce entire continents to molten slag. What awaited them on the surface of the rebel homeworld was no longer the principled resistance they had originally been sent to suppress, but something far more dangerous and fundamentally alien to everything the Imperium represented. The orbital approach to Badab Primaris revealed a world transformed by years of corruption, and the accelerating influence of powers that operated beyond the normal bounds of reality. Atmospheric readings detected chemical compositions that violated known scientific principles, while electromagnetic signatures emanated from the planet's surface in patterns that suggested technological capabilities far exceeding anything in Imperial arsenals. Most disturbing were the visual observations that showed geographical features apparently shifting when observed from different angles, as if the planet's very structure had become subject to influences that transcended normal physical laws. The Palace of Thorns had grown beyond its original magnificent proportions into a complex that defied architectural understanding and challenged the sanity of those who attempted to comprehend its current configuration. Spires twisted in directions that seemed to exist outside normal three-dimensional space, while defensive installations incorporated designs that appeared to have been conceived by intelligence operating according to non-human aesthetic and engineering principles. The fortress that had once represented the pinnacle of Space Marine military architecture had become something that hurt to look at directly and induced psychological distress in even the most hardened veterans. Chapter Master Carib Calm of the Red Scorpions assumed overall command of the siege operations, bringing to the task a reputation for absolute ruthlessness and an uncompromising commitment to eliminating chaos corruption wherever it manifested. His preliminary assessment of the tactical situation concluded that conventional siege warfare would prove inadequate against defensive installations that appeared to operate according to principles that violated established understanding of physics and engineering. The solution he proposed represented the most devastating application of Space Marine firepower in the long history of the Adeptus Astartes. The bombardment of the Palace of Thorns began with a coordinated orbital strike that channeled the combined firepower of multiple battle barges and strike cruisers into concentrated salvos designed to overwhelm any possible defensive measures through sheer destructive magnitude. The energy released during the initial bombardment exceeded the total output of most stellar bodies, yet the palace complex demonstrated resilience that defied every known principle of materials science and structural engineering. Defensive systems that should have been vaporized instantly continued functioning, while architectural elements seemed to repair themselves faster than they could be destroyed. The ground assault that followed the orbital bombardment required coordination between forces from multiple chapters whose tactical doctrines and operational procedures had been developed independently over centuries of separate service. Firehawk's assault marines led the initial penetration of outer defensive perimeters, their jump packs allowing rapid deployment and extraction that minimized exposure to defensive systems whose capabilities remained largely unknown. Red Scorpion's Terminators provided heavy assault capabilities that proved essential for breaching fortified positions that conventional weapons could not effectively engage. The Minotaur's chapter's participation in the siege demonstrated tactical doctrines and equipment capabilities that exceeded what their official records suggested should have been available to them. Their assault operations incorporated weapons and techniques that appeared to have been specifically designed for combating chaos corruption, while their tactical coordination suggested access to intelligence about palace defenses that conventional reconnaissance could not have provided. The effectiveness of their operations against corrupted defenders raised questions about their true nature and origins that would never be satisfactorily answered. The defending Astral Claws forces that loyalist assault teams encountered within the palace complex bore little resemblance to the Space Marines they had once been, their enhanced capabilities and altered appearance providing clear evidence of the corruption that had consumed their chapter. Battle Brothers, who had once embodied the finest traditions of the Adeptus Astartes, now fought with abilities that exceeded normal Space Marine limitations, while displaying behavioral patterns that suggested their psychological conditioning had been fundamentally altered by influences that operated beyond human understanding. The advance through the palace's outer districts required sustained combat operations in environments that violated normal understanding of architecture and physics, with corridors that seemed to extend indefinitely and chambers whose dimensions appeared to change based on the observer's position and mental state. Loyalist forces found themselves fighting battles in spaces where conventional tactics proved inadequate while facing enemies whose capabilities suggested enhancement through means that Imperial science could neither understand nor replicate. Huron Blackheart's personal command center lay deep within the palace complex, accessible only through passages that served as killing grounds, designed to maximize casualties among attacking forces while channeling survivors toward confrontations with defenders whose corruption had advanced to levels that made them barely recognizable as having once been human. The psychological pressure of fighting through environments where reality itself seemed unstable, took a devastating toll on loyalist morale, while the gradual revelation of the full extent of chaos corruption tested their spiritual resilience beyond normal limits. The discovery of ritual chambers and ceremonial spaces within the palace revealed the true purpose for which the complex had been modified during the rebellion's later phases, providing clear evidence that the Astral Claws leadership had been conducting activities that violated every principle of imperial orthodoxy, while serving purposes that were fundamentally hostile to human welfare and survival. The artifacts and installations found in these areas required immediate destruction to prevent their continued influence, while their very existence provided justification for the most extreme measures against all personnel who might have been exposed to their corrupting effects. The final confrontation between Loyalist assault teams and Huron himself took place in a throne room that defied conventional description, its dimensions and configurations seeming to shift based on the psychological state and spiritual condition of those who entered. The being that had once been Lufgt Huron, chapter master of the Astral Claws, now bore only superficial resemblance to the warrior he had been, his transformation into something fundamentally inhuman having progressed to the point where his continued existence represented a clear and immediate threat to all human life in the surrounding region. The combat capabilities that Huron displayed during the final battle exceeded anything in recorded Space Marine history. His enhanced strength and tactical awareness suggesting augmentation through means that drew upon powers operating beyond normal physical limitations. His weapons and equipment incorporated technologies whose function appeared to violate established understanding of how Imperial gear operated, while his tactical coordination with remaining defenders demonstrated capabilities that suggested forms of communication and control that transcended normal human limitations. The intervention of Loyalist psychers during the crucial moments of the final confrontation proved essential for preventing Huron's escape through methods that would have enabled his continued threat to Imperial security and human welfare. The psychic battle that accompanied the physical combat revealed the true extent of his corruption, while demonstrating the capabilities that chaos enhancement could provide to those willing to abandon their humanity in exchange for supernatural power and influence. The destruction of critical installations within the palace complex triggered cascading failures throughout the fortress's supernatural enhancement systems, creating immediate degradation in the capabilities and resilience that had enabled its remarkable defensive performance. The collapse of the artificial influences that had sustained the palace's impossible architecture created immediate structural failures that threatened all personnel within the complex, while providing opportunities for final assault operations against remaining resistance. The attempted escape that marked Huron's final desperate gambit involved the activation of systems within the palace's deepest chambers that opened portals to dimensions beyond normal space-time, creating immediate threats to the spiritual welfare of all personnel in the surrounding area, while providing means for evacuation that would have enabled continued corruption and threat to Imperial security. The successful disruption of these escape attempts required sacrifices from Loyalist forces whose heroism prevented catastrophic consequences for the broader Imperial war effort. The survival and escape of the being that had once been Lufgt Huron represented the single greatest failure of the siege operations, creating a lasting threat that would continue to plague Imperial security for centuries, while providing a rallying point for other Chaos forces seeking to exploit Imperial weaknesses. The transformation of the former chapter master into something calling itself Huron Blackheart marked the birth of a new form of threat that combined Space Marine capabilities with Chaos enhancement in ways that presented unprecedented challenges for Imperial defense planning. The final destruction of the Palace of Thorns required the use of weapons and techniques that had been held in reserve for the most extreme circumstances, their deployment creating environmental damage that would render large portions of Badab Primaris uninhabitable for generations, while ensuring that no trace of chaos corruption could survive to threaten future Imperial operations. The scorched earth tactics employed during the final phases of the siege demonstrated the lengths to which Imperial forces were prepared to go to eliminate threats to human spiritual welfare and Imperial security. The immediate aftermath of the siege operations revealed the true scope of corruption that had infected not just the Astral Claws leadership, but entire populations throughout the Badab sector, requiring extensive purification operations that would continue for decades while Imperial authorities struggled to determine which elements of the former alliance could be trusted, and which required immediate elimination to prevent continued threat to Imperial security and human welfare. The smoking ruins of Badab Primaris in early 913.M41 presented Imperial authorities with challenges that conventional military doctrine had never anticipated. The successful suppression of the Secessionist alliance had eliminated an immediate threat to Imperial unity, but the revelation of chaos corruption at the heart of the rebellion created complications that would require decades to resolve fully. The 18 star systems that had once represented a showcase of alternative governance now stood as monuments to the price of betraying one's oaths to the Emperor, their populations traumatized by years of war and the terrible knowledge of how thoroughly they had been deceived. The scattered survivors of Astral Claws forces presented the most immediate security concern for Imperial forces attempting to restore order throughout the former rebel territory. Intelligence estimates suggested that anywhere from several hundred to over 1,000 corrupted Space Marines had escaped the destruction of their homeworld, taking with them weapons, equipment, and knowledge that could prove devastating if employed in service of Chaos forces elsewhere in the galaxy. Hunt and destroy operations to locate and eliminate these fugitives would consume Imperial resources for years while creating constant anxiety about where and when they might resurface. The Mantis Warriors faced perhaps the most complex judgment of any alliance. Chapter, due to their genuine horror at discovering the true nature of their rebellion, combined with their undeniable participation in activities that had aided Chaos forces. Chapter Master Devram Korda's cooperation with Imperial investigators had provided crucial intelligence about Alliance operations and remaining threats, but could not erase the reality that his chapter had fought against loyal Imperial forces for over a decade. The solution imposed by Imperial justice was both merciful and devastating, condemning the chapter to a 100-year penitent crusade in the galactic northeast, where they would serve as expendable assault troops against the most dangerous enemies humanity faced. The Executioner's chapter received similar condemnation to penitent crusade service, though their active participation in eliminating corrupted elements within Alliance territory earned them slightly more favorable terms for their penance. Chapter Master Thulsa Kane's decision to begin hunting down Chaos-tainted Alliance personnel, as soon as their corruption became apparent, had prevented additional atrocities while providing Imperial forces with valuable intelligence about enemy capabilities and locations. However, their years of rebellion could not be overlooked, and their assignment to hazardous duty represented the minimum punishment compatible with Imperial justice and the need to maintain discipline throughout the Adeptus Astartes. The Lamenters paradoxically faced the harshest judgment, despite their early withdrawal from the Alliance and active cooperation with Loyalist forces during the final campaigns. Their tragic history of misfortune and persecution had made them vulnerable to manipulation, but Imperial authorities could not ignore their participation in the rebellion, regardless of their motivations or ultimate recognition of their error. The century-long penitent crusade imposed upon them would add another chapter to their already devastating history of sacrifice and suffering in service to an Imperium that seemed determined to test their loyalty through endless hardship. The Firehawks claimed the honor of victory in the Badab campaign, their unwavering loyalty and effective military performance, earning them recognition as the primary heroes of the Loyalist response. Chapter Master Stibor Lazaria's leadership during the siege operations had been instrumental in coordinating the complex multi-chapter assault that finally breached the Palace of Thorns, while his chapter's casualties in service to Imperial unity provided clear evidence of their devotion to the Emperor's will. The honors and recognition bestowed upon the Firehawks would prove tragically ironic given their mysterious disappearance in the warp during their next major deployment. The Red Scorpion's reputation for absolute purity and uncompromising devotion to Imperial orthodoxy received enormous enhancement through their participation in the Badab campaign. Chapter Master Karib Kuln's tactical leadership and spiritual authority had been crucial for maintaining Loyalist morale during the most difficult phases of the siege, while his chapter's specialized equipment and techniques for combating chaos corruption had proven invaluable for eliminating threats that conventional weapons could not effectively address. The Red Scorpions emerged from the campaign with enhanced status that would serve them well in future operations against heretical forces. The civilian populations throughout former Alliance territory required extensive re-education and spiritual purification to eliminate the lingering effects of exposure to chaos corruption during their years under rebel governance. Imperial authorities faced the challenge of distinguishing between populations that had been genuinely deceived and those that had actively embraced corruption, while determining appropriate methods for rehabilitation that would restore their loyalty without causing unnecessary suffering. The scale of the task required the deployment of ecclesiarchy personnel and Inquisition specialists whose work would continue for generations. The restoration of imperial administration throughout the Badab sector proved more complex than anticipated due to the thoroughness with which Alliance governance had replaced traditional imperial institutions. Local officials who had served the rebellion faced execution or imprisonment, creating massive gaps in administrative expertise that had to be filled by personnel from other regions who lacked familiarity with local conditions and populations. The resulting inefficiency and cultural conflicts created resentment that would simmer for decades while complicating efforts to restore the economic productivity that had made the sector valuable to the broader Imperium. The assignment of a new Space Marine chapter to guard the Badab sector represented both practical necessity and symbolic statement about Imperial determination to prevent future rebellions. The newly founded Carcharodon's chapter received responsibility for protecting the region while serving as a constant reminder to local populations about the consequences of defying Imperial authority. Their mysterious origins and brutal reputation made them particularly suitable for deterring potential dissidents, while their lack of connection to local populations eliminated the personal relationships that had contributed to the original rebellion. Mining operations throughout the sector required complete reconstruction due to the destruction caused by siege warfare and the need to eliminate facilities that had been corrupted by chaos influence during the Alliance period. The restoration of economic productivity that had made the region valuable to Imperial tides would require massive investment and years of development work, while new security protocols were implemented to prevent future infiltration by hostile forces. The economic cost of rebuilding exceeded the value of several years of normal tribute, making the rebellion's suppression a Pyrrhic victory from a purely financial perspective. Imperial Navy forces faced the challenge of hunting down scattered Alliance fleet elements that had escaped the final battles around Badab Primaris. These vessels, many of them captured or modified Imperial ships, possessed detailed knowledge of Imperial procedures and capabilities that made them extremely dangerous opponents. The need to eliminate these threats before they could join other hostile forces or establish bases in remote regions required extensive patrol operations that would strain Imperial naval resources for years. The investigation of Alliance activities and capabilities provided Imperial intelligence services with crucial information about how chaos corruption could infiltrate and subvert even the most loyal Space Marine forces. The techniques that had been employed to deceive Alliance leadership and gradually corrupt their objectives became the subject of intensive study, leading to enhanced screening procedures and monitoring protocols designed to detect similar threats before they could achieve comparable success. However, the sophisticated nature of the corruption also revealed vulnerabilities in Imperial security that would require fundamental changes to address effectively. Inquisition specialists faced the daunting task of examining captured Alliance equipment and installations to determine which elements could be safely salvaged, and which required immediate destruction to prevent continued chaos influence. The technological innovations that Alliance forces had developed during their rebellion included both conventional improvements that could benefit Imperial forces and corrupted devices whose continued existence posed unacceptable risks to anyone who might encounter them. The sorting process required expertise that few individuals possessed, while the stakes of making mistakes could prove catastrophic. The documentation and analysis of Alliance governance methods provided valuable insights into alternative approaches to Imperial administration, though the corruption that had ultimately consumed the rebellion made it impossible to determine which innovations had genuine merit and which had been designed to serve chaos objectives. The efficiency and popular support that Alliance authorities had achieved during their Golden Age suggested possibilities for improving Imperial governance, but the need to avoid repeating their mistakes made any adoption of their methods politically and spiritually dangerous. The psychological impact of the Badab War on Space Marine culture extended far beyond the immediate participants to affect attitudes and policies throughout the Adeptus Astartes. The revelation that entire chapters could be corrupted and turned against their oaths created new emphasis on spiritual purity and loyalty verification that would influence Space Marine training and operational procedures for centuries. The precedent of Space Marines fighting Space Marines in prolonged warfare created trauma that required new forms of psychological support and spiritual counseling to address effectively. Religious authorities throughout the Imperium faced the challenge of explaining how the Emperor's finest warriors could have been so thoroughly deceived and corrupted while maintaining the faith and confidence of populations whose loyalty depended on their belief in Space Marine infallibility. The theological implications of the rebellion required careful analysis and reinterpretation of established doctrine, while new emphasis was placed on the importance of constant vigilance against chaos corruption, even among the most trusted servants of the Emperor. The strategic implications of the rebellion's suppression included enhanced cooperation protocols between different Space Marine chapters, and improved communication networks designed to enable rapid response to similar threats in the future. The isolation that had enabled the Alliance to develop its capabilities without Imperial interference was addressed through new monitoring and reporting requirements, while the coordination problems that had delayed effective Imperial response were resolved through organizational changes that would prove their value in subsequent crises. The reverberations of the Badab War continued to shape Imperial policy and Space Marine culture for centuries after the last shots were fired on the ruins of Badab Primaris. What had begun as a regional rebellion against bureaucratic inefficiency evolved into a defining moment that fundamentally altered how the Imperium understood the relationship between central authority and local governance, between loyalty and independence, and between the sacred trust placed in Space Marine chapters and the eternal vigilance required to ensure that trust was never betrayed again. The technological legacy of the conflict manifested in enhanced cooperation protocols between loyal Space Marine chapters that revolutionized how the Adeptus Astartes coordinated operations across vast interstellar distances. The communication networks developed in response to Alliance capabilities enabled rapid information sharing between chapters while maintaining operational security against potential infiltration by hostile forces. Most significantly, the standardized procedures for detecting and responding to chaos corruption became mandatory training for all Space Marine personnel, creating uniform standards for spiritual purity that had been lacking during the pre-war period. The Carcharodon's chapter's assignment to permanent guardianship of the Badab sector established precedents for Imperial responses to regional rebellions that would influence policy throughout the galaxy. Their mysterious origins and brutal reputation made them ideal enforcers of Imperial will, while their lack of connection to local populations eliminated the personal relationships that had contributed to the original rebellion. The success of their deterrent effect inspired similar deployments of outside chapters to regions showing signs of potential unrest, creating a network of loyalist forces specifically positioned to prevent future secessionist movements. The cultural impact of Space Marines fighting Space Marines in prolonged warfare created psychological trauma that required new approaches to spiritual counseling and chapter identity. The revelation that even the Emperor's finest could be corrupted challenged fundamental assumptions about Space Marine reliability while forcing the development of enhanced screening procedures for detecting spiritual weakness or susceptibility to corruption. Chaplains throughout the Adeptus Astartes received additional training in recognizing and countering heretical influences, while chapter recruitment practices incorporated new psychological evaluation techniques designed to identify potential vulnerabilities before enhancement procedures began. The Mantis Warriors' century-long penitent crusade became a template for how Imperial justice could balance punishment with practical utility, allowing corrupted chapters to redeem themselves through service in the most dangerous assignments available. Their deployment to the galactic northeast against Orc incursions and Chaos Raiders demonstrated how former rebels could be transformed into effective Imperial assets while paying the price for their previous betrayal. The success of their rehabilitation inspired similar approaches to other instances of chapter corruption, creating alternatives to the complete dissolution that had been the traditional response to Space Marine heresy. The ongoing threat posed by Huron Blackheart and his Red Corsairs warband represented perhaps the most significant long-term consequence of the rebellion's incomplete suppression. The former Astral Claws leader's survival and transformation into a Chaos Lord created a rallying point for other renegade Space Marines, while providing a powerful symbol of successful resistance to Imperial authority. His raids against Imperial shipping lanes and recruitment activities among disaffected Space Marine elements continued to threaten Imperial security decades after the formal end of the Badab War, requiring constant vigilance and resource allocation to contain. The expansion of the Maelstrom's influence following the war's conclusion created permanent changes to the strategic situation in the galactic southeast that affected Imperial defense planning for generations. The Warp Storm's growth consumed several star systems that had been important contributors to regional stability, while creating new routes for chaos incursions that required enhanced defensive measures. The The correlation between the rebellion's chaos corruption and the Maelstrom's expansion provided clear evidence of the connection between spiritual corruption and physical reality, reinforcing the importance of maintaining absolute loyalty to Imperial doctrine. The precedent established by successful resistance to Imperial authority inspired independence movements throughout the galaxy that manifested in everything from delayed tithe payments to open rebellion against Imperial officials. Planetary governors who had previously accepted Imperial directives without question began expressing concerns about policies that seemed designed to benefit distant bureaucrats rather than local populations. The ideological appeal of space marine autonomy continued to resonate among frontier regions where Imperial presence was weak and local threats required immediate response. The economic disruption caused by the war's devastation required decades of reconstruction effort that strained Imperial resources while providing valuable lessons about the true cost of internal conflicts. The Badab sector's productive capacity, which had once exceeded that of entire subsectors, remained below pre-war levels for over a century while new security measures and monitoring systems absorbed resources that might otherwise have been available for expansion and development. The financial burden of suppressing the rebellion served as a powerful argument for preventing similar conflicts through improved governance and earlier intervention. The religious implications of the conflict forced fundamental reassessment of Imperial theology regarding the nature of space marine loyalty and the possibility of redemption for those who had been corrupted. The ecclesiarchy developed new doctrines emphasizing the importance of constant vigilance against spiritual corruption, while maintaining hope for salvation through sincere repentance and sacrificial service. The theological debates inspired by the war's events influenced Imperial religious practice throughout the galaxy, while providing justification for enhanced monitoring of all military forces. The intelligence-gathering capabilities demonstrated by Alliance forces during the conflict inspired comprehensive reform of Imperial security procedures designed to prevent similar penetration of sensitive installations and command structures. The revelation that rebel agents had operated successfully within Imperial facilities for years without detection led to enhanced screening procedures for all personnel with access to classified information, while creating new protocols for monitoring and evaluating the loyalty of individuals in sensitive positions. The diplomatic relationships that Alliance leadership had established with neighboring sectors created lasting suspicion about the reliability of local authorities and the need for enhanced Imperial oversight of regional governance. The trade agreements and mutual defense pacts that had supported Alliance independence demonstrated how economic incentives could undermine political loyalty, leading to new restrictions on inter-sector cooperation that required approval from higher Imperial authority before implementation. The military innovations developed during the conflict influenced space marine tactical doctrine throughout the galaxy as successful techniques were analyzed and incorporated into standard training, while methods that had proven vulnerable to chaos corruption were identified and eliminated. The combined arms tactics that had given Alliance forces advantages over traditional Imperial formations became part of Loyalist doctrine, while the coordination protocols that had enabled effective multi-chapter operations became standard procedure for large-scale Imperial military operations. The psychological impact on civilian populations throughout the former Alliance territory created lasting changes in attitudes toward Imperial authority and space marine protection that required careful management to prevent future unrest. The revelation that their beloved protectors had been corrupted created disillusionment and suspicion that complicated efforts to restore normal Imperial governance while making populations vulnerable to other forms of heretical propaganda. The rehabilitation of civilian loyalty required educational programs and cultural initiatives that continued for generations. The technological innovations that had given Alliance forces capabilities exceeding Imperial standards became the subject of intensive study aimed at understanding which improvements could be safely adopted and which incorporated elements that served corrupt purposes. The weapons systems, manufacturing techniques, and organizational methods developed during the rebellion included both conventional advances that could benefit Imperial forces and corrupted elements whose adoption would create unacceptable risks to spiritual purity and operational security. The legal precedents established by the war's aftermath influenced Imperial justice throughout the galaxy, as courts and administrative bodies struggled to balance the need for punishment with practical considerations about maintaining effective governance and military capability. The treatment of former Alliance personnel became a template for addressing similar situations, while the rehabilitation programs developed for corrupted populations provided models for dealing with other instances of widespread spiritual contamination. The strategic lessons learned during the conflict influenced Imperial military planning for centuries as commanders incorporated insights about the challenges of fighting corrupted Space Marine forces and the importance of rapid response to potential rebellion. The coordination difficulties that had delayed effective Imperial response led to organizational changes that improved communication and resource allocation, while the tactical innovations that had proven effective against rebel forces became part of standard Imperial doctrine for internal security operations. The memorial installations established throughout the former Alliance territory served both to honor the loyalist forces who had sacrificed their lives to suppress the rebellion and to remind future generations about the consequences of betraying one's oaths to the Emperor. These monuments became focal points for Imperial ceremonies, celebrating loyalty and dedication while providing visual reminders of the price that rebels and their supporters could expect to pay for defying Imperial authority. In the depths of the 42nd millennium, as Lufgt Huron's return has fundamentally altered the balance of power within the Imperium and new threats emerge from the growing rift that splits the galaxy in half, the lessons of the Badab War have taken on renewed significance that extends far beyond their original historical context. The rebellion that once seemed like a distant tragedy confined to a single sector now serves as a crucial reference point for understanding how even the most loyal servants of the Emperor can be corrupted, how seemingly noble causes can mask the most insidious threats, and how the price of independence from Imperial authority may prove to be damnation itself. Recent archaeological expeditions to the ruins of Badab Primaris have uncovered evidence that challenges many assumptions about the timeline and scope of chaos corruption within the original rebellion. Sealed chambers discovered beneath the devastated remains of the Palace of Thorns contained artifacts whose design and construction clearly predate the establishment of the Astral Claws chapter by several millennia. These findings suggest that the corruption which ultimately consumed the rebellion may have been present in the region long before Lufgt Huron's arrival, waiting for the right circumstances and the right individuals to exploit. The implications are terrifying, suggesting that chaos influence operates on timescales that dwarf human understanding while demonstrating patience and strategic planning that exceeds what Imperial theologians had previously attributed to the dark powers. Equipment caches discovered throughout the former Badab sector continue to yield weapons and technology that incorporate innovations whose principles remain beyond Imperial understanding even centuries after their creation. Tech priests assigned to analyze these artifacts report capabilities that exceed theoretical performance parameters while operating according to engineering principles that seem to violate established laws of physics and materials science. Most troubling are indications that some of these devices continue to function despite being cut off from their power sources and maintenance systems for over a millennium, suggesting technological principles that transcend conventional understanding of how Imperial equipment operates. The ongoing activities of Huron Blackheart's Red Corsairs warband provide clear evidence that the rebellion's legacy continues to threaten Imperial security throughout the galaxy. Recent intelligence reports document successful recruitment operations that have drawn renegade Space Marines from dozens of different chapters, creating a force whose capabilities rival those of the original Secessionist alliance while operating with the enhanced coordination and strategic insight that chaos corruption provides. The Red Corsairs' raids against Imperial shipping lanes have evolved beyond simple piracy to become sophisticated operations designed to acquire specific technologies and personnel whose purposes remain unclear but are certainly inimical to Imperial welfare. Classified Inquisition reports on chaos corruption patterns analyzed in the aftermath of the Badab War have provided crucial insights that influenced responses to subsequent rebellions and heretical movements throughout the galaxy. The techniques employed to gradually corrupt Alliance leadership while maintaining their belief in the righteousness of their cause have been documented and studied, leading to enhanced screening procedures and monitoring protocols designed to detect similar threats before they can achieve comparable success. However, the sophisticated nature of the corruption also revealed fundamental vulnerabilities in Imperial security that required comprehensive reforms to address effectively. The precedents established by the Badab War have profoundly influenced how Imperial authorities respond to expressions of Space Marine independence and autonomy in the current era. When Lufgt Huron returned to active leadership of the Imperium, his initial reforms faced resistance from chapter masters who cited the Badab example as evidence of what happened to Space Marines who challenged established Imperial authority. The Primarch's response demonstrated sophisticated understanding of the lessons learned from the rebellion, as he carefully distinguished between legitimate reform efforts and the kind of gradual separation from Imperial authority that had enabled chaos corruption to take root in the Badab sector. Modern chapter organization and deployment patterns reflect lessons learned from the Alliance's ability to coordinate operations across multiple chapters while maintaining independence from Imperial oversight. Current protocols require regular rotation of chapter assignments and enhanced communication between different Space Marine forces to prevent the kind of isolation and insularity that enabled the Secessionist alliance to develop its capabilities without Imperial interference. The geographic distribution of chapter homeworlds has been modified to ensure that no single region contains concentrations of Space Marine power sufficient to challenge Imperial authority if they were to act in concert. The influence of the Badab War on current Imperial military doctrine extends beyond Space Marine operations to affect how Imperial forces approach internal security and rebellion suppression throughout the galaxy. The coordination difficulties that delayed effective Imperial response to the original rebellion led to organizational changes that improved communication and resource allocation between different military commands, while the tactical innovations that proved effective against corrupted Space Marine forces became part of standard Imperial doctrine for operations against heretical forces. Contemporary chaos incursions often demonstrate strategic approaches and tactical capabilities that echo methods first documented during the Badab conflict, suggesting that the rebellion served as a testing ground for techniques that chaos forces continue to employ against Imperial targets. The gradual corruption of leadership while maintaining popular support, the exploitation of legitimate grievances to justify increasingly extreme measures, and the use of technological enhancements to provide capabilities that transcend normal human limitations all represent patterns that Imperial intelligence services now recognize as indicators of potential chaos involvement in regional conflicts. The rehabilitation programs developed for former Alliance territories became templates for addressing widespread spiritual contamination in other regions affected by chaos corruption. The educational initiatives, cultural reforms, and religious counseling techniques that proved effective in restoring Imperial loyalty among populations that had been exposed to heretical influences for extended periods provided models that have been employed throughout the galaxy when similar situations arise. However, the long-term success of these programs remains questionable, as subsequent rebellions and heretical movements in former Alliance territory suggest that complete spiritual rehabilitation may be impossible to achieve. Recent developments in the broader galactic situation have created conditions that make the lessons of the Badab War more relevant than ever before. The emergence of the Great Rift has isolated many regions from regular Imperial contact, creating situations similar to the frontier conditions that originally enabled the Astral Claws to develop their independence without immediate Imperial interference. Chapter masters throughout the galaxy now face decisions about how to balance loyalty to distant Imperial authority against immediate responsibility for protecting populations under their care. Decisions that echo the dilemmas that originally led Lufgt Huron down the path to corruption and damnation. The theological implications of the Badab War continue to influence Imperial religious doctrine as the ecclesiarchy struggles to explain how the Emperor's finest warriors could be so thoroughly corrupted while maintaining the faith and confidence of populations whose loyalty depends on their belief in Space Marine reliability. Recent sermons and theological treatises emphasize the importance of constant vigilance against spiritual corruption while maintaining hope for redemption through sincere repentance and sacrificial service, themes that resonate with current concerns about the spiritual welfare of Imperial forces operating in increasingly dangerous and isolated conditions. Intelligence networks throughout the galaxy continue to monitor for signs of the sophisticated corruption patterns that enabled Chaos forces to manipulate Alliance leadership while concealing their true objectives from most Alliance personnel. The techniques employed to gradually shift loyalties and moral reasoning while maintaining surface compliance with Imperial doctrine represent ongoing threats that require constant vigilance to detect and counter effectively. The challenge is complicated by the fact that many of the warning signs associated with chaos corruption can also indicate legitimate reform efforts or reasonable responses to changing strategic conditions. The question of whether other frontier chapters might attempt similar rebellions under current galactic conditions has become a matter of intense concern for Imperial strategic planners. The isolation created by the Great Rift, combined with the enhanced threats that many regions now face, has created conditions where local chapter commanders might reasonably conclude that their immediate responsibilities conflict with distant Imperial directives. The challenge for Imperial authorities is distinguishing between legitimate tactical decisions and the kind of gradual separation from Imperial authority that enabled the original corruption to take root. The impact of current Imperial military doctrine on Space Marine independence reflects careful balance between the need for local initiative and the imperative to prevent the kind of isolation that enabled the Badab Rebellion to develop without Imperial knowledge or interference. Enhanced communication requirements, regular reporting protocols, and mandatory coordination with other Imperial forces all serve to maintain connection between individual chapters and broader Imperial command structures, while preserving the tactical flexibility that makes Space Marines effective in rapidly changing combat situations. Future developments in Imperial governance and military organization will inevitably be influenced by the precedents established during the Badab War and the ongoing threat posed by chaos corruption of Imperial forces. The challenge facing current Imperial leadership is creating systems that provide adequate oversight and control to prevent future rebellions while maintaining the independence and initiative that make Space Marines effective protectors of human civilization. The balance between central authority and local autonomy remains as crucial and as difficult to achieve as it was during the era when Lufgt Huron first began his fateful journey toward corruption and rebellion. The legacy of the Badab War serves as eternal reminder that in the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, even the most noble intentions can be corrupted by forces that operate beyond human understanding, while the greatest heroes can become the most dangerous enemies, if they abandon the spiritual discipline and absolute loyalty that define true service to the Emperor of mankind. The echoes of that ancient conflict continue to reverberate through every decision made by Space Marine commanders. Every moment of autonomy questioned by Imperial oversight, and every frontier world where local needs seem to conflict with distant Imperial directives. The price of independence from Terra's authority remains what it has always been: the risk of damnation itself, while the only true safety lies in unwavering faith and absolute obedience to the God Emperor's will, however distant and incomprehensible it may sometimes seem to those who must implement it in the crucible of constant warfare that defines existence in the 42nd millennium.